They are the worst thing in the galaxy. Not the most powerful. The Chaos Gods hold that distinction, and the Tyrannid Hive fleets and the Necron dynasties contest it from their own terrible angles. Not the most numerous. The Orcs breed in numbers that defy the mathematics the Imperium uses to track them. Not the most fanatical. The forces of chaos and the servants of the imperial faith exceed the Drukhari in the purity of their convictions by margins that the Drukhari would find amusing if the Drukhari found anything amusing that did not involve suffering. The worst. The most deliberately, consciously, systematically cruel civilization the galaxy has produced in its 14 billion-year history. A species whose culture is built on the infliction of agony, whose economy runs on the currency of screams, whose survival, and this is the part that transforms the Drukhari from mere monsters into something more horrifying, depends on the suffering they produce. The cruelty is not a choice. This is the fact that makes the Drukhari comprehensible, and that makes the comprehension worse than the incomprehension it replaces. The Drukhari are not cruel because they enjoy cruelty, though they do enjoy it, with an enthusiasm that exceeds what the word enjoy can capture. The Drukhari are cruel because the cruelty is the only thing that keeps them alive. Their sadism is metabolic, their torture is biological. The agony they inflict on the galaxy's sentient species is the food their souls consume to prevent those souls from being consumed by the god that their ancestors created. Slaanesh hunts them, the Dark Prince, the Chaos God born from the Aeldari's own excess, the deity whose birth destroyed the Aeldari Empire and consumed the souls of trillions of the Aeldari's population, claims every Aeldari soul at the moment of death. The claim is not figurative. It is the literal, physical, observable reality that every Aeldari experiences. The slow, continuous drain of the soul's energy toward the god whose appetite the Aeldari's existence feeds. The Craftworld Aeldari resist the drain through discipline, the spirit stones, the infinity circuit, the path system, the elaborate, structured, culturally embedded mechanisms that the Craftworld populations maintain to protect their souls from Slaanesh's consumption. The Craftworld answer to Slaanesh is abstinence. Restraint, the careful, deliberate suppression of the emotional excess that Slaanesh feeds on, maintained through centuries of practiced self-denial. The Drukhari resist the drain through indulgence. Not their own indulgence, the indulgence of the fool, the pleasure cult's excess, the behavior that created Slaanesh, the indulgence of others' suffering. The Drukhari discovered in the millennia after the fall that the psychic resonance of pain, the energy that suffering produces in the immaterium, the warp vibration that agony generates in the minds of the beings who experience it, can be absorbed, consumed, fed upon, and the feeding replenishes what Slaanesh drains. The equation is simple and monstrous. Slaanesh drains the Drukhari's souls. The Drukhari inflict suffering on other beings. The suffering produces psychic energy. The Drukhari absorb the energy. The absorption replenishes the soul. The drain is counteracted. The Drukhari survive. The survival requires suffering, not the Drukhari's suffering. The suffering of others. The suffering of slaves, of captives, of the populations the Drukhari raid from across the galaxy. The suffering of beings who are taken from their worlds and brought to the Dark City and subjected to the agonies that the Drukhari's survival demands and that the Drukhari's ingenuity has refined across 10,000 years of practice into an art form that the word torture does not begin to encompass. This is the Drukhari, the cruelest survivors in the galaxy. The beings who chose, when the fall destroyed their civilization and the god they created began to devour their souls, to survive through the infliction of suffering rather than through the practice of restraint. The beings who built a civilization on agony, an economy on scream, a culture on the creative application of pain to the bodies and the minds of every species the galaxy contains. The Drukhari are monsters. The Drukhari are also survivors. The two are inseparable, because the monstrousness is the survival and the survival is the monstrousness. And the distinction between the two is the distinction the Drukhari do not recognize, because the distinction would require the moral lens that the Drukhari's existence has made impossible. They feed, or they die. They cause suffering, or Slaanesh consumes their souls. They raid, or they shrivel. The galaxy is their larder, the species are their food, and the hunger never stops. The Drukhari are the Aeldari who did not learn the lesson. The fall, the catastrophe that destroyed the Aeldari Empire, that birthed Slaanesh, that tore the Eye of Terror into reality and consumed the souls of trillions, was produced by excess. The Aeldari Empire's population, freed from the constraints that material scarcity imposed on every other civilization, descended into the pursuit of sensation without limit. The pleasure cults, the organizations that arose to provide increasingly extreme experiences to a population whose ordinary pleasures had been exhausted, grew in power and in depravity across the millennia of the Empire's decline, their activities feeding the warp entity that their activities were creating. The fall was the consequence. The birth of Slaanesh was the excess reaching its ultimate expression, the combined psychic output of trillions of Aeldari directed into the pursuit of sensation, producing a consciousness in the warp whose nature was the sensation the Aeldari had been pursuing. Slaanesh was born screaming. The scream tore reality, the Eye of Terror opened, the Aeldari Empire died. The survivors responded in different ways. The Exodites, the Aeldari who had left the Empire before the fall, who had colonized the Maiden Worlds and returned to a pre-technological existence, survived because their departure had placed them outside the excess's influence. The Craftworld Aeldari, the Aeldari who had recognized the danger and fled aboard the massive vessels whose self-sustaining ecosystems permitted the escape, survived because their departure was accompanied by the cultural reformation that the danger demanded. The Craftworld Aeldari chose discipline. They chose the path system. They chose the restraint that would protect their souls from Slaanesh's appetite. The Drukhari chose differently. The beings who would become the Drukhari were, at the time of the fall, the pleasure cults themselves. The Aeldari whose pursuit of sensation had been the most extreme, whose involvement in the excess had been the most complete, whose relationship with the behaviors that produced the fall was the most intimate. These were not the Aeldari who had been caught up in the excess by cultural circumstance. These were the Aeldari who had driven the excess, the architects of the depravity, the beings whose pursuit of sensation had been the engine that powered the civilization's descent. They survived because they were in the webway. The sub-realms of the webway, the pocket dimensions, the hidden spaces, the constructed environments that the Aeldari's mastery of the webway had produced across the Empire's history, provided shelter from the fall's psychic shockwave. The Aeldari who were inside the webway when Slaanesh was born were shielded from the immediate destruction that consumed the Empire's core populations. The webway's walls absorbed the shockwave, The beings inside the walls survived. They survived, and they did not change. This is the Drukhari's founding decision, and the decision defines everything the Drukhari have become. The Craftworld Aeldari survived and changed, abandoning the excess, adopting the discipline, restructuring their entire civilization around the avoidance of the behaviors that produced the fall. The Drukhari survived and refused the change. The beings whose excess had caused the catastrophe looked at the catastrophe's consequences and decided that the excess was not the problem. The excess was the solution. The decision was not irrational. The decision was pragmatic, in the specific, cold, survival-focused pragmatism that the Drukhari would make their civilization's defining quality. The Drukhari discovered that suffering could be consumed, that the psychic resonance of agony could be absorbed to replenish the soul energy Slaanesh was draining, that the excess, redirected from the pursuit of personal sensation to the infliction of sensation on others, could sustain the Drukhari's existence without the restraint the Craftworld populations had adopted. The restraint was a cage. The Drukhari saw what the Craftworld Aeldari had become: the disciplined, structured, emotionally constrained societies whose path system channeled the Aeldari's prodigious emotional range into managed, controlled, culturally approved expressions. And the Drukhari refused the cage. The cage might protect the soul, but the cage also imprisoned the being the soul inhabited, and the imprisonment was a form of death that the Drukhari considered worse than the death Slaanesh offered. Better to live in agony, other beings' agony, consumed and metabolized and converted into the soul energy the survival required, than to live in the restraint the Craftworld populations had accepted. Better to be a monster than a monk. Better to feed on suffering than to deny oneself the emotional range the Aeldari's nature provided. The Drukhari chose freedom, the freedom to feel everything the Aeldari's heightened emotional palette could produce, without the constraints the Craftworld populations imposed on the palette's expression. The freedom was purchased at the cost of other beings' suffering, and the cost was paid by the beings who had no choice in the payment. The slaves, the captives, the populations whose agony the Drukhari's survival consumed. The choice was made. The choice cannot be unmade. The Drukhari's civilization, 10,000 years of culture, of tradition, of institutional infrastructure built around the infliction of suffering, is the choice's accumulated consequence. The beings who refused to change after the fall have built a civilization on the refusal, and the civilization's continuation depends on the refusal's maintenance. Because the alternative, the adoption of the Craftworld's restraint, the acceptance of the discipline the Craftworld populations maintain, would require the dismantling of everything the Drukhari have built. The Drukhari will not dismantle. The Drukhari will not change. The fool's lesson which the Craftworld Aeldari learned and the Exodites never needed is the lesson the Drukhari refused to acknowledge. They caused the catastrophe. They are living in its consequences. They are sustaining themselves through the same behaviors that produced the catastrophe, and they will not stop. Because stopping is dying, and the Drukhari refuse to die. Commorragh is not a city. Commorragh is a dimension. The term Dark City captures the aesthetic, but not the scale. Commorragh is built inside the webway, the network of tunnels between dimensions that the Old Ones created and the Aeldari inherited, and the building has been ongoing for longer than the Imperium has existed. The Drukhari have been constructing, expanding, and elaborating Commorragh for over 10,000 years. and the construction's accumulated product is a habitable space whose volume exceeds what the term city can contain. Commorragh's population exceeds entire star systems. The Dark City's inhabitants number in the billions, the Drukhari themselves, the slaves the Drukhari's raids have captured, the mercenaries and the outcasts and the Xenos who have found their way into the webway's passages and who have settled in Commorragh's margins. The population is not counted. The Drukhari do not maintain census records. The Drukhari's institutional culture does not value the quantification of assets whose existence is too fluid and too expendable to merit the tracking. The city is vertical. Commorragh's structures extend upward and downward through the webway's dimensional space, with a disregard for conventional gravity that the webway's malleable physics permits. Spires, the towering structures that house the Cabal's headquarters, the Archon's palaces, the residences of the Drukhari's ruling class, extend kilometers above the city's baseline, their peaks lost in the haze of the stolen sun's radiance. Below, the city descends into the depths, the lower levels where the slaves are processed, where the homunculi maintain their laboratories, where the beings whose status places them at the bottom of Commorragh's hierarchy exist in conditions that exceed the 41st millennium's standard for miserable. The stolen suns illuminate the city. The Ilmea, dying stars that the Drukhari have captured through methods the Imperium's astrophysicists would classify as impossible, are suspended in the webway's dimensional space above Commorragh's structures, providing the light and the energy that the Dark City's functioning requires. The suns are dying. The Drukhari do not stabilize the suns or maintain them. When a stolen sun expires, the Drukhari steal another. The expendability of entire stars captures the Drukhari's relationship with resources. Everything is consumed. Everything is discarded when the consumption is complete. Everything is replaced through the raid's next expedition. The webway gates connect Commorragh to the material universe. The gates, the portals that provide passage between the webway's dimensional space and the galaxy's conventional real space, are Commorragh's arteries, the channels through which the Dark City's lifeblood flows. The lifeblood is slaves. The gates open into the material universe at locations the Drukhari have identified as suitable for raiding, and the raiders pass through the gates, conduct their operations in real space, and return to Commorragh with the captives the operations have produced. The gates are numerous. Commorragh's connection to the material universe is not limited to a single portal or a handful of access points. The Dark City connects to the galaxy through thousands of gates, scattered across the Imperium's territory, across Xenos space. Across every region of the galaxy, the Aeldari's ancient mastery of the webway has provided access to. A Drukhari raiding force can emerge from a gate on a world the Imperium considers safe, conduct the raid in hours, and return to Commorragh through the same gate before the world's defenders can organize a response. The geography of Commorragh is divided into High Commorragh and Low Commorragh, and the division is social as much as spatial. High Commorragh is where the power resides, the spires of the great cabals, the arenas of the witch cults, the palaces of the Archons whose wealth and whose military capability place them at the top of the Dark City's vicious hierarchy. Low Commorragh is where the powerless exist. The slaves, the disenfranchised Drukhari, whose status has not permitted them access to the upper levels. The creatures and the beings whose presence in the Dark City serves the powerful, without providing the powerless with the benefits the powerful enjoy. The sprawls occupy the spaces between the residential districts. If the term can be applied to environments whose conditions would violate every habitation standard the Imperium maintains, house the Drukhari's common population, the beings whose status places them above the slaves but below the Cabal's warriors. The sprawls are dangerous. The violence that defines Commorragh's social dynamics is most intense in the sprawls, where the competition for status and for resources produces the constant, low-level warfare that the Dark City's culture treats as normal. Null zones are the city's most feared regions, areas of Commorragh where the webway's dimensional stability has broken down, where the walls between the webway and the warp have thinned to the point where demonic entities can breach the barrier and enter the Dark City's space. The null zones are quarantined when they are identified, sealed by the Drukhari's forces, and abandoned by the city's population. The null zones grow. The webway's stability is declining. The damage that the fall produced and that the millennia of subsequent use have compounded is eroding the barriers that separate the webway from the warp, and the erosion produces new null zones at a rate that the Drukhari's quarantine efforts struggle to match. The null zones are Commorragh's future, if the future is long enough. The slow expansion of the dimensional instability, the gradual erosion of the barriers that protect the Dark City from the dimension that the Dark City's inhabitants fled to escape, is the existential threat that the Drukhari's 10,000-year residence in the webway has not addressed. The city that was built to shelter the Drukhari from Slaanesh is slowly losing the structural integrity that the sheltering requires. The Drukhari do not plan for the long term. The Dark City's culture, the constant competition, the vicious politics, the focus on immediate survival rather than strategic planning, does not produce the institutional responses that long-term threats demand. The null zones grow. The Drukhari quarantine them. The quarantining buys time. The time is consumed by the same activities the time's buying was supposed to address. Commorragh is a city that is eating itself. The metaphor is not idle. The Drukhari's civilization is consuming the resources its continuation requires without replenishing them. The dimensional stability that the webway provides being degraded by the use the Drukhari impose upon it, the stolen suns dying, the gate's connections to the material universe becoming less reliable as the webway's overall integrity declines. The Dark City endures because the Dark City has endured for 10,000 years, and the endurance's momentum carries the city forward through conditions that the momentum eventually cannot sustain. But not yet. For now, Commorragh stands. The spires reach, the stolen suns burn, the slaves scream. The Dark City lives, in its fashion. The fashion involves a great deal of dying, but not the Drukhari's. Never the Drukhari's. Asdrubal Vect is the ruler of Commorragh, and the ruling is the product of the most remarkable individual achievement in the galaxy's 10,000-year post-fall history. Vect was born a commoner, in a civilization whose social hierarchy is determined by birth, where the noble houses whose lineages stretch back to the pre-fall Aeldari aristocracy occupy the apex of the power structure, and where the commoners whose bloodlines carry no such distinction occupy the position the aristocracy assigns them. Vect was born without status, without connection, without any of the advantages the Dark City's social structure provides to the beings fortunate enough to be born into the correct families. Vect was sold into slavery as a child. The detail is essential because the detail captures the distance the journey covered. the being who would become the supreme overlord of the Dark City, the most powerful individual in a civilization that spans dimensions and whose population exceeds billions, began as property. Chattel, a child whose existence was valued by the social structure at the price a buyer would pay for the labor the child's body could provide. The slavery gave Vect two things. The first was hatred, the absolute, burning, patient hatred of the aristocracy that had reduced him to property, the noble houses whose inherited privilege placed them at the top of a hierarchy the privileged had not earned, and that the unprivileged had not chosen. Vect's hatred of the nobility was not the momentary rage that injustice produces in most beings. It was structural, embedded in Vect's character by the slavery's experience, refined across the decades that followed the slavery's end, maintained across the millennia of Vect's subsequent career as the fuel that the career's ambition required. The second thing the slavery gave Vect was understanding. The slave who is sold as a child and who survives the slavery's conditions develops an understanding of power that the powerful do not possess. Because the slave experiences power from the receiving end. The slave understands what power does to the beings it is applied to. The slave understands the powerful's weaknesses, the assumptions the powerful make, the blind spots the privilege produces, the vulnerabilities that the powerful's position creates, and that the powerful's comfort prevents them from recognizing. Vect recognized every vulnerability. The slave who watched the aristocrats became the freed slave who studied the aristocrats, became the commoner who manipulated the aristocrats, became the archon who destroyed the aristocrats. The progression took centuries, because the progression required the patience the hatred sustained, and the precision the understanding provided. Vect founded the Cabal of the Black Heart. The founding was the first step, the creation of the institutional base that Vect's ambition required, the military and political organization whose growth would eventually provide the capability the ambition's fulfillment demanded. The Cabal of the Black Heart was Vect's tool, built from the commoners and the outcasts, and the ambitious whose exclusion from the aristocracy's privileges made them receptive to the alternative Vect offered. The alternative was revolution. Not the sudden, violent, disorganized uprising that the oppressed typically produce. The calculated, patient, methodical dismantling of the aristocratic order through the manipulation of the aristocracy's own weaknesses. Vect did not attack the noble houses directly. Vect manipulated the noble houses into attacking each other, exploiting the rivalries and the jealousies and the paranoia that the Drukhari's competitive culture produced in the beings whose status depended on the maintenance of advantages the competition constantly threatened. The aristocrats destroyed each other. Vect ensured the destruction by providing the provocations, the false intelligence, the carefully timed revelations that transformed the aristocracy's endemic competition into open warfare. House fought house. Cabal fought cabal. The noble families whose inherited privilege had maintained Commorragh's power structure for millennia tore each other apart. And Vect, the slave, the commoner, the founder of the Cabal of the Black Heart, positioned his forces to fill the vacuum the mutual destruction produced. The rise took millennia. The term captures the patience, not decades, not centuries, millennia. Vect's ascent from slave to overlord was conducted across a time span that exceeds the Imperium's entire existence. The patience sustained by the hatred's fuel and the understanding's precision and the Aeldari's biological immortality, which provided Vect with the timescale the ascent's complexity required. Vect engineered incidents that shattered his rivals. The most famous was the luring of an Imperial battleship into Commorragh itself, a deliberate provocation that brought the Imperium's military directly into the Dark City, producing the chaos and the destruction that Vect's remaining rivals could not survive, but that Vect's own preparations had anticipated. The Imperial vessel was destroyed. The rival cabals that the vessel's arrival had thrown into disarray were destroyed alongside it. Vect emerged from the incident as the Dark City's undisputed ruler. The undisputed status is maintained through the same methods that produced it. Vect's rule over Commorragh is not maintained through the institutional legitimacy that conventional governance relies on. It is maintained through fear, through capability, through the demonstrated willingness and ability to destroy anyone who challenges the Overlord's position. Vect does not govern Commorragh. Vect controls Commorragh through the cabal of the Black Heart's military capability, through the intelligence networks Vect maintains across the Dark City's population, through the personal capability that millennia of survival in the galaxy's most dangerous political environment have refined. Vect is the most dangerous individual in the galaxy, who is not a god or a primarch. The statement is defensible. The being who rose from slavery to the rulership of a civilization that occupies a dimension, whose personal capability encompasses military, political, and strategic domains with equal sophistication, whose survival across millennia of the Drukhari's vicious politics demonstrates a quality of intelligence and adaptability that exceeds what any other individual in the galaxy has demonstrated. Vect is without equal among mortal beings. The Drukhari both worship and loathe their overlord. The worship is the admiration that the Drukhari's culture extends to the successful, the being who has risen to the top of the hierarchy through the methods the hierarchy rewards. The loathing is the awareness that Vect's success has been produced through the manipulation and the destruction of every being who has ever threatened his position, including the Drukhari whose destruction Vect's rise required. Vect is the Drukhari's mirror, the civilization that survives through the infliction of suffering on others is ruled by a being who rose to power through the infliction of suffering on his own kind. The methods are the same. The scale is different. The outcome is the same. Survival through the creative application of pain. Vect survives. Commorragh survives. The two are connected because Vect has made himself necessary. The Overlord, whose capability maintains the Dark City's functioning, whose intelligence network prevents the internal conflicts from producing the destruction the conflict's intensity would otherwise generate, whose rule is the stability that the Drukhari's vicious culture would not produce without the ruler's imposition. The Drukhari need Vect. The Drukhari hate that they need Vect. The need and the hatred are the relationship the Dark City's culture produces between the ruled and the ruler, and the relationship has been maintained for millennia, because the alternative, the chaos that Vect's removal would produce, is worse than the rule the removal would eliminate. Vect knows this. Vect ensures this. The Overlord whose rise from slavery was produced by the exploitation of vulnerabilities is the Overlord who ensures that his own removal would produce the consequences the ruled cannot afford. The slave became the master. The master ensures the slaves cannot become what the slave became. The circle is the Drukhari's governance. The circle is complete. The circle has been turning for millennia. The Cabals are the backbone of Drukhari society, and the backbone is made of knives. A Cabal is a military political organization, part army, part court, part criminal enterprise. The Cabal provides its members with the institutional structure the Dark City's survival requires, the military capability for conducting raids into realspace, the political influence for navigating Commorragh's vicious hierarchy, and the economic resources for sustaining the members' existence in a civilization whose economy runs on suffering. An Archon leads each Cabal. The Archon is the Cabal's supreme authority, the being whose personal capability and whose political acumen have placed the Archon at the top of the Cabal's internal hierarchy, and whose maintenance of that position is the Archon's primary occupation. An Archon who is not plotting is an Archon who is being plotted against, and the difference between the two states is the difference between the Archon who rules and the Archon who is replaced. The replacement is always violent. The succession within a Cabal is not managed through the institutional mechanisms that conventional civilizations employ. The elections, the appointments, the orderly transfers of authority that the Imperium's governance maintains. The succession within a Cabal is managed through murder. The ambitious subordinate who wishes to become Archon must kill the current Archon, and must do so in a manner that the Cabal's culture recognizes as legitimate, which is to say, in a manner that demonstrates the subordinate's superiority rather than the subordinate's luck. The assassination must be clever. A subordinate who kills the Archon through brute force, through the simple application of violence without the cunning that Drukhari's culture values, earns the Cabal's contempt rather than the Cabal's respect. The successful assassination is the assassination that the Archon could not have prevented, the trap the Archon's intelligence did not detect, the betrayal the Archon's paranoia did not anticipate, the strike that the Archon's defenses did not address. The cleverness is the qualification. The killing is the application. The constant threat of assassination produces Archons of extraordinary capability. The being who has survived the Drukhari's political environment long enough to reach the Archon's position, and who has maintained the position against the sustained, creative, institutionally encouraged attempts to remove them, is a being whose intelligence, whose paranoia, whose capacity for preemptive violence exceeds what any environment less demanding than the Dark Cities could produce. The Cabals range in size from small gangs to armies. The Cabal of the Black Heart, Vect's Cabal, the Dark City's dominant military force, commands resources that exceed what most Imperial subsectors can deploy. The lesser Cabals, the smaller organizations whose Archon's ambitions have not yet produced the growth the Black Heart's millennia of accumulation have provided, operate with the resources their raid's success has generated. The Cabal's wealth proportional to the Cabal's raiding capability. The Cabalite warriors are the Cabal's standard soldiers, the Drukhari whose military training and whose equipment provide the combat capability the raids require. A Cabalite warrior is not a conscript or a serf. The warrior is a member of the Cabal by choice. A Drukhari who has chosen the Cabal's service because the Cabal's membership provides the resources and the protection the Dark City's conditions demand. The warriors fight with splinter weapons, rifles and pistols that fire crystalline toxin-coated projectiles whose impact delivers the poisons the Drukhari's hematoxicologists have developed across millennia of refinement. The splinter weapons do not kill through kinetic force. They kill through pain. The toxins the weapons deliver produce an agony in the target that exceeds what conventional weapons generate. The pain's intensity serving both the tactical purpose of incapacitating the target and the metabolic purpose of producing the suffering the Drukhari's soul feeding requires. The pain is the point. The Drukhari's weapons are designed to produce maximum suffering with minimum killing, because the dead do not suffer, and the Drukhari require suffering, not death. A raid that kills its targets is a failed raid. The target's deaths have eliminated the suffering the target's living bodies would have produced across decades of captivity in Commorragh's slave pens. The successful raid captures. The Drukhari's raiders emerge from the webway gate, engage the target population with the speed and the violence the raid requires, incapacitate the targets through the splinter weapons toxins and the melee weapons disabling strikes, and drag the captives back through the webway gate into Commorragh before the target world's defenses can organize a response. The raids are lightning fast. The Drukhari's vehicles, the raiders, the venoms, the ravagers that carry the Kabbalite warriors into the engagement are anti-gravity craft, whose speed exceeds what the Imperium's ground vehicles can match. The vehicles emerge from the webway gate at speed, the warriors deploying from the vehicles' open decks while the vehicles are moving. The engagement conducted at a tempo that the target population's defenders cannot match, because the defenders' tactical doctrine was not designed for enemies who move this fast. The speed is the advantage. The Drukhari do not fight conventional battles. The Drukhari do not establish positions, do not hold ground, do not engage in the sustained combat that conventional warfare produces. The Drukhari raid, strike fast, take the captives, leave the entire engagement, from the gates opening to the gates closing, lasts hours at most. The target world's population learns what has happened after the Drukhari have gone, the missing people, the damaged buildings, the horror that the raid's survivors carry in the memories they will never fully process. The Cabals compete. The competition between Cabals is the Dark City's primary social dynamic, the rivalry between Archons producing the raid's escalation, the alliance's formation and dissolution, the betrayals that the competition's intensity inevitably generates. A Cabal that conducts a successful raid earns status. A Cabal that fails earns contempt. The status and the contempt are the currency of Commorragh's social economy, and the currency's accumulation determines the Cabal's position in the hierarchy the competition maintains. The competition is managed, barely, by Vect's overarching authority. The Supreme Overlord permits the competition because the competition is productive. The Cabal's rivalry drives the raid's frequency and the raid's quality, producing the suffering the Dark City's population requires. But the competition is constrained. Vect's intelligence network and Vect's military capability prevent the competition from escalating into the open warfare that would threaten the Dark City's stability. The Cabals are the Drukhari's civilization expressed through military organization. The raiding, the competition, the assassination, the politics. These are the mechanisms through which the Drukhari's survival is maintained. The institutional structure through which the suffering the survival requires is produced and distributed. The backbone is made of knives. The knives cut outward, into the galaxy, and the knives cut inward into each other. Trust does not exist in Commorragh. The absence is not a cultural observation, it is a survival principle. A Drukhari who trusts is a Drukhari who has provided an opening, and the opening will be exploited. because the exploitation of openings is what the Dark City's culture rewards and what the Dark City's conditions demand. The politics of Commorragh are the politics of a civilization in which every relationship is transactional, every alliance is temporary, and every kindness is a trap. The Drukhari do not cooperate because cooperation is valued. The Drukhari cooperate because the cooperation produces advantages the individual cannot produce alone, and the cooperation lasts exactly as long as the advantages persist. The moment the cooperation ceases to produce advantages, the moment the alliance's costs exceed the alliance's benefits, the alliance ends. The ending is often violent. The Archon's courts are the most dangerous environments Commorragh produces, and the danger is produced by the intelligence of the beings who inhabit them rather than by the violence the beings employ. An Archon's court, the political space that surrounds the Cabal's leader, is a web of competing ambitions whose threads the Archon must navigate, without the navigation's failures producing the assassination the threads are designed to facilitate. The courtier's scheme. The lieutenant's plot. The subordinates evaluate. Every being in the Archon's proximity is simultaneously serving the Archon and assessing the Archon, simultaneously contributing to the Cabal's functioning and preparing for the Cabal's eventual change of leadership that the Drukhari's culture treats as inevitable. The inevitability is the poisoned gift. The Drukhari know that every Archon will eventually be replaced, killed by a subordinate whose ambition has exceeded the subordinate's patience, destroyed by a rival whose capability has exceeded the Archon's defenses. The knowing produces the paradox that defines Commorragh's political culture. The Archon whose leadership is most secure is the Archon whose subordinates have not yet developed the capability or the opportunity to execute the replacement the culture prescribes. The Cabal of the Poisoned Tongue is the political culture's most extreme expression, led by Lady Aurelia Maylis, the Archon whose political cunning the Dark City's observers describe as approaching Vekt's own. The Poisoned Tongue operates through deception as its primary method. The Cabal's wars are fought through manipulation, through the provision of false intelligence to rivals, through the engineering of conflicts between enemies that the Cabal itself does not participate in, but whose outcomes the Cabal's manipulation determines. The Cabal of the Flayed Skull is the political culture's opposite. The Cabal whose approach to power is conducted through military force rather than political manipulation, led by warriors whose preference for direct action exceeds the political subtlety Commorragh's culture normally demands. The Flayed Skull's Archon maintains power through the demonstrated capability to destroy any rival who challenges the Archon's position through force. The Cabal of the Obsidian Rose specializes in the production and the trade of weapons. The Cabal whose wealth is generated through the armaments the Cabal manufactures, and that the other Cabal's armies require. The Obsidian Rose's Archon maintains power not through military force or political manipulation, but through economic necessity. The Cabal's weapons are the best in Commorragh, and the Cabals that depend on the weapons are Cabals whose dependence provides the Obsidian Rose with the political leverage the dependence generates. The three methods, manipulation, force, and economic leverage, are the three pillars of Commorragh's political structure, and the pillars support the same edifice, the power's maintenance through the methods the power's holder has mastered. Vekt stands above the pillars, the supreme overlord whose mastery encompasses all three methods, the manipulation, the force and the economic leverage, maintains the position the mastery produces through the integration of the methods the individual cabals employ separately. Vect manipulates. Vect can deploy force. Vect controls economic resources. The combination makes the Overlord's position unassailable through any single method's application, because the defense the Overlord maintains encompasses the methods the attackers would employ. The political culture produces beings of extraordinary capability. The Drukhari who survive Commorragh's politics, who navigate the alliances and the betrayals and the assassinations and the power shifts that the political culture generates, are beings whose intelligence and whose adaptability exceed what less demanding political environments produce. A Drukhari Archon who has maintained power for centuries is a being whose political acumen exceeds what most imperial governors achieve across lifetimes of service, because the Archon's survival has been tested by conditions the governor's existence does not approach. The political culture also produces beings of extraordinary cruelty. The politics of a civilization in which trust is suicide and kindness is weakness produce beings whose capacity for cruelty has been refined through the same selective pressure the politics impose. The Drukhari who rises in Commorragh's hierarchy is the Drukhari who has demonstrated the willingness to do what the hierarchy's conditions demand. And the conditions demand cruelty. The specific, targeted, creatively applied cruelty that eliminates rivals, that deters challengers, that maintains the position the cruelty's application has produced. The cruelty is not gratuitous. The cruelty is political, the tool the political conditions produce, applied with the precision the conditions demand. A Drukhari Archon who is cruel without purpose is an Archon who has wasted resources. A Drukhari Archon who is cruel with purpose is an Archon who has invested resources in the outcome the cruelty produces. The investment's returns are measured in power. The power is measured in survival. The survival is the only metric Commorragh's political culture recognizes. Everything else, honor, loyalty, kindness, the virtues the galaxy's other civilizations maintain, is the weakness the Dark City's conditions exploit. The Dark City does not reward virtue. The Dark City rewards capability. The capable survive. The virtuous do not. 10,000 years of the selection have produced a civilization whose inhabitants are the most capable and the most cruel beings the galaxy has generated. The two qualities are the same quality, expressed through different channels. Commorragh does not distinguish between them. The witch cults are Commorragh's beating heart, and the heart pumps blood. Not metaphorical blood. The arenas of the witch cults are places of slaughter, vast amphitheaters carved into Commorragh's dimensional space, seating hundreds of thousands of Drukhari spectators who watch the killing with the appetite of a civilization that requires the watching to survive. The witches fight. The slaves die. The spectators feed, absorbing the psychic resonance of the suffering the arena produces, the collective consumption replenishing the souls that Slaanesh is slowly draining. The witch cults are the mechanism through which Commorragh's general population accesses the soul-sustaining suffering the Drukhari's biology demands. Not every Drukhari can participate in real space raids. Not every Drukhari has the resources to maintain a personal stable of slaves whose suffering the individual can consume at leisure. The arenas provide the access. The nightly spectacles of pain and death that the witch cults perform for the masses, the suffering distributed across the audience through the psychic medium that the arena's killing generates. The arenas are Commorragh's most popular entertainment and Commorragh's most important public service. And the two are the same thing. The entertainment is the service. the spectacle of the killing feeds the spectators' souls. The feeding prevents the spectators' degradation, the slow, visible, horrifying withering that a Drukhari who does not feed on suffering undergoes as Slaanesh's drain depletes the soul energy the feeding would have replenished. A Drukhari who does not feed ages. The immortality that the Aeldari's biology provides, the functional agelessness that the species' genetics sustain, is conditional for the Drukhari. The condition is feeding. A Drukhari who feeds regularly on suffering maintains the youth and the vitality the Aeldari's biology is designed to produce. A Drukhari who does not feed withers, the skin tightening, the features hollowing, the body deteriorating, as the soul energy drains and the physical form reflects the spiritual depletion. The withering is the Drukhari's most terrifying personal experience, and the withering's visibility is the Drukhari's most effective social motivator. A Drukhari who appears at a social function showing the signs of insufficient feeding, the aged skin, the dimmed eyes, the physical evidence of the soul's depletion, is a Drukhari whose status has collapsed. The appearance is the declaration, this being cannot feed. This being cannot sustain itself. This being is dying. The witch cults prevent the withering through the arena's mass distribution of suffering. The spectacles ensure that even the Dark City's poorest inhabitants, the commoners whose resources do not permit the maintenance of personal slaves, can access the soul-sustaining agony the survival requires. The witches themselves are warriors of extraordinary capability. The gladiators who perform in the arenas are not simply fighters, they are artists. The witches' combat style emphasizes grace, speed, and the aesthetic quality of the killing, the violence conducted as performance, the death delivered with the artistry the audience demands and the witch training provides. A witch fights unarmored. The gladiatorial tradition prescribes the vulnerability. The witch enters the arena without the protection that the Kabbalite warrior's armor provides, relying instead on the speed and the agility the witch training has developed. The vulnerability is the spectacle's element of risk. The audience's engagement sustained by the awareness that the witch's survival is not guaranteed, and that the spectacle might produce the witch death alongside the slave's deaths. The combat drugs enhance the performance. The witch cults administer pharmaceutical cocktails whose effects amplify the witch's speed, the witch's reflexes, the witch's tolerance for pain and fatigue beyond what the unaugmented Aeldari biology can produce. The drug's effects are temporary. The drug's side effects are cumulative. The witch, whose career spans decades of drug-enhanced combat, is a being whose body carries the accumulated damage the drugs have produced, and the damage is managed through the homunculi's restorative services, which the witch must pay for with the currency the arena's performances generate. The economy is circular. The wick fights to earn. The earnings pay for the drugs enhance the fighting earns the resources. The resources sustain the wick's existence in a civilization where existence without resources is existence without feeding, and existence without feeding is the withering. A succubus leads each wick cult. The succubus is the cult's greatest fighter, the being whose arena record demonstrates the combat mastery the cult's culture celebrates, and whose political acumen permits the management of the cult's institutional affairs. The succubus is the witch cult's equivalent of the Cabbal's Archon, the leader whose position is maintained through demonstrated superiority and whose removal requires the challenger's demonstrated superiority to exceed the leader's. Lelith Hesperax is the greatest witch the Dark City has produced. and the greatness is the product of a capability that the witch cult's standard training cannot explain. The succubus of the cult of strife, the oldest and most prestigious witch cult in Commorragh, Hesperax fights without drugs. The combat pharmaceuticals that every other witch relies on for the enhanced performance the arena's demands require, Hesperax does not use them. The succubus fights with natural capability alone, and the natural capability exceeds what the drugs produce in other witches. Hesperax fights with nothing but knives, not the elaborate weaponry the witch cult's armories provide, not the hydra gauntlets, the shard nets, the razor flails whose exotic damage profiles the arena's variety demands. Knives, simple, unadorned blades carried in each hand, wielded with a speed and a precision that the arena's spectators describe in the language the Aeldari reserve for the transcendent. The transcendence is real. Hesperax's combat capability exceeds what the Aeldari's biological envelope should permit. The speed approaches the psychic. The precision approaches the prescient. The performance approaches the supernatural without crossing the threshold that the Drukhari's prohibition against psychic powers makes dangerous. Whether Hesperax's capability is the product of extraordinary natural talent, or exceptional training, or some quality of the succubus's nature that the standard categories do not accommodate, is debated within the witch cult's culture without resolution. The debate does not matter. Hesperax fights. Hesperax wins. The winning has continued for centuries. The arenas sustain Commorragh. The witch cults sustain the arenas. The witches sustain the cults through the fighting that produces the suffering that feeds the spectators whose attendance sustains the institution that sustains the civilization. The heart pumps blood. The blood is not the Drukhari's. The homunculi are the dark city's most terrifying inhabitants, and the terrifying is a professional assessment rather than a casual judgment. A homunculus is a flesh crafter, a sculptor of living tissue, a being whose mastery of the biological sciences exceeds what any other civilization in the galaxy has produced, applied to purposes that the biological sciences' conventional practitioners would classify as obscene. The homunculus reshapes living bodies, altering, enhancing, degrading, transforming the physical forms of beings whose consent is not sought, and whose suffering is the process's purpose as much as the process's product. The homunculi's art is pain, not the crude pain that a torturer produces through the application of violence to the body's sensitive structures. The refined, precise, scientifically informed pain that a master produces through the understanding of the body's pain pathways, the identification of the nervous system's vulnerabilities, the application of stimuli whose effects are calibrated to produce the maximum suffering the body can sustain, without the suffering producing the death that would end it. The homunculi keep their subjects alive. This is the homunculi's most impressive and most horrifying capability: the maintenance of the subject's life through the agonies the homunculus inflicts. The biological expertise sustaining the body's functions while the body's capacity for suffering is exploited to its fullest extent. A homunculus's subject can be kept alive and conscious through procedures that would kill a being whose biological support systems were not maintained by the homunculus's intervention. The subjects suffer for decades. The homunculus art does not operate on the timescale of a single session. The flesh crafter's work extends across years and decades of sustained modification. each session building on the previous session's alterations. The subject's body progressively transformed into the specific form the homunculus's artistic vision prescribes. The subject is awake for the transformation. The subject feels the transformation. The feeling is the point. The homunculi covens are the organizations the homunculi maintain, the professional associations whose members share the techniques, the resources, and the institutional infrastructure the art requires. The covens operate in the lower reaches of Commorragh, the deep spaces, the hidden laboratories, the sealed chambers where the homunculi conduct their work away from the general population's observation. Not because the population would object. The population would not. The population understands that the homunculi's work serves the Dark City's needs. The suffering the work produces feeds the souls of the Drukhari who observe it, and the products the work generates serve the military and the social functions the Dark City's civilization requires. The products include warriors. The homunculi create the racks, the flesh-altered soldiers whose bodies the homunculi have modified for combat, the biological enhancements, and the surgical alterations producing warriors whose physical capabilities exceed the unmodified Drukharis. The racks serve the covens as soldiers, bodyguards, and assistants. Their loyalty to their creating homunculus, sustained by the awareness that the homunculus can unmake them as easily as the homunculus made them. The grotesques are the homunculi's heavy units, beings whose bodies have been modified beyond the point of recognition, the original anatomy replaced by the monstrous forms the homunculus's art has imposed. A grotesque is a walking weapon, a massive, misshapen, pain-racked creature whose combat capability exceeds what the original body could have produced. Sustained by the drugs and the biological modifications the homunculus has administered and motivated by the agony the modifications continuously produce. The grotesques were once Drukhari. This detail is worth stating, because the detail transforms the grotesque from a monster into a tragedy. The being whose body has been warped into the monstrous form the homunculus designed was once a Drukhari, a member of the Dark City's population whose misfortune, whose political failure, whose inability to protect themselves from the homunculus's attention produced the captivity the modification requires. The Talos pain engines are the homunculi's most significant contribution to the Drukhari's military capability. Towering constructs whose combat systems are powered by the suffering of the living beings the engine contains. The pain engine is not a machine in the conventional sense. It is a torture device that fights, the living subjects wired into the engine's structure, their agony providing the psychic energy the engine's weapons and the engine's locomotion consume. The pain engines are the Drukhari's relationship with suffering expressed through military technology. The weapons that fight the Drukhari's enemies are powered by the suffering of the beings the Drukhari have enslaved. The metaphor is the reality. The suffering is the fuel. The fuel drives the weapon. The weapon produces the conditions, the raids, the conquests, the captives, that produce the fuel the weapon consumes. The homunculi can resurrect the dead. This is the Coven's most valuable service, and the service through which the homunculi maintain their position in Commorragh's power structure. A Drukhari Archon who is killed, assassinated by a rival, killed in combat, destroyed through any of the violent methods the Dark City's culture produces, can be resurrected by a homunculus who has preserved the Archon's biological material, and whose skill permits the reconstruction of the Archon's body and the recall of the Archon's soul from Slaanesh's grasp. The resurrection is not free. The homunculus who resurrects a dead Archon demands payment, and the payment is typically something the Archon would prefer not to provide. A favor, a debt, a commitment whose terms the homunculus defines and whose fulfillment the homunculus enforces. The resurrected Archon is indebted. The debt is the homunculus's power, the hold the Covens maintain over the Cabal's leaders through the service the Cabal's leaders cannot obtain elsewhere. The resurrection's availability transforms the Drukhari's relationship with death. In a civilization where death means Slaanesh's consumption of the soul, the final, irreversible, terrifying end that every Drukhari fears above all other outcomes. The homunculi's ability to reverse death is the most valuable service the Dark City produces. The homunculi hold the key to survival in a civilization whose members' survival is the civilization's only genuine value. The power this provides the homunculi is immense. The Covens do not compete for political position the way the Cabals do. The homunculi do not need to compete, because the homunculi's monopoly on resurrection provides a position that competition cannot threaten, and that the Cabal's military capability cannot override. An Archon who threatens a homunculus is an Archon who has threatened the being whose service the Archon will need when the Archon's next assassination succeeds. The homunculi are Commorragh's true power, not the visible power the Cabals wield, not the political power Vect maintains through the Black Heart's military capability. The invisible, structural, monopoly-sustained power that the homunculi hold through their exclusive control of the service every Drukhari desperately needs. The Fleshcrafters work in the dark. The Fleshcrafters hold the keys to life and death. The Fleshcrafters are the most patient beings in a civilization of patient schemers, because the homunculi know that every Archon, every succubus, every powerful being in the Dark City will eventually need what only the homunculi can provide. The dead will need to live again, and the homunculi will be waiting. With the price. Death is different for the Drukhari than for any other being in the galaxy, and the difference makes the Drukhari the galaxy's most death-fearing civilization. When a human dies, the soul disperses into the warp. The dispersal is not pleasant. The warp's predatory entities consume the soul's energy, but the dispersal is not personalized. The warp's consumption of a human soul is the consumption of a resource. The human soul is fuel. The consumption is impersonal. When a Drukhari dies, Slaanesh takes the soul personally, not the diffuse consumption that the warp's general predation produces. The Dark Prince is focused, individualized, deliberately agonizing consumption of the specific Drukhari soul that Slaanesh has been slowly draining across the Drukhari's entire lifetime. The consumption is not impersonal. The consumption is intimate, Slaanesh taking the soul the way a connoisseur consumes a delicacy, savoring the suffering the consumption produces, extracting the maximum agony from the soul's dissolution. The Drukhari know this. Every Drukhari, from the lowest slave-born commoner to Asdrubal Vect himself, carries the awareness that death is not the end. Death is the beginning of an eternity of suffering at the hands of the god the Drukhari's ancestors created. The awareness is not theoretical. The awareness is visceral. The drain that every Drukhari feels, the continuous pull of Slaanesh on the soul, is the preview of what the death's completion will produce. The fear of death is the Drukhari's primary motivator. Not the fear of dying, the physical process that the Drukhari's biology, like any mortal biology, is designed to avoid. The fear of what happens after dying. The fear of Slaanesh, the fear of the consumption that the death provides and that the living's soul-feeding delays. The fear drives everything. The raids are driven by the fear, the necessity of feeding to sustain the soul against the drain that death would complete. The politics are driven by the fear, the competition for the resources the feeding requires, the status seeking that provides the access to the suffering the feeding demands. The cruelty is driven by the fear, the infliction of agony on others as the alternative to the agony Slaanesh will inflict on the Drukhari whose death permits the infliction. The homunculi's resurrection capability transforms the fear's landscape. A Drukhari who knows the homunculi can reverse death is a Drukhari whose fear of death has been modified, not eliminated, because the resurrection is not guaranteed, but reduced. Because the resurrection provides the possibility that death is not permanent, and that Slaanesh's consumption can be interrupted by the recall the homunculi's science provides. The recall is not free. A Drukhari whose death has been reversed by a homunculus returns to life owing a debt the homunculus defines. The debt is the homunculus's power, the leverage the resurrection provides, the hold the homunculus maintains over every Drukhari who has died and been resurrected, and who knows that the next death's reversal depends on the homunculus's continued willingness to provide the service. The willingness is conditional. The homunculus who resurrects a Drukhari does so for reasons the homunculus determines, and the reasons always serve the homunculus's interests. The resurrection of an Archon who serves the homunculus's purposes is a resurrection the homunculus will perform. The resurrection of an Archon who opposes the homunculus's purposes is a resurrection the homunculus will decline. The declination is the homunculus's ultimate weapon, the refusal to reverse the death, the consignment of the dead Drukhari to Slaanesh's consumption, the permanent end that the Drukhari's fear has spent its entire existence attempting to prevent. The homunculi have themselves died and been resurrected so many times that the process has become routine. The senior homunculi, the ancient fleshcrafters whose existence spans millennia, have died and returned dozens or hundreds of times, each death and each resurrection refining the homunculus's understanding of the death's experience and the resurrection's process. The senior homunculi do not fear death because the senior homunculi have arrangements, the biological preparations, the soul-anchoring technologies, the institutional safeguards that ensure their resurrection regardless of the circumstances the death produces. The arrangements make the homunculi functionally immortal, not the conditional immortality the Drukhari's feeding sustains, the functional immortality of beings who cannot permanently die, because the technology the beings have developed and the arrangements the beings have established ensure the reversal of every death the beings experience. The functional immortality produces the perspective the homunculi bring to Commorragh's politics. The fleshcrafters who cannot permanently die regard the Archon's power, struggles with the patience of beings for whom the struggle's outcomes are temporary. The Archon who dies and is not resurrected is gone. The Archon who dies and is resurrected owes the homunculus. The homunculus who cannot permanently die waits. The waiting is the power. The death fear and the resurrection possibility define the Drukhari's relationship with mortality in ways the galaxy's other civilizations cannot replicate. No other civilization in the galaxy experiences death as the Drukhari do. The certainty of Slaanesh's consumption combined with the possibility of the homunculi's reversal, the fear tempered by the hope conditioned by the price the hope's fulfillment demands. The Drukhari do not die well. The galaxy's other species, the humans, the orcs, the Aeldari of the Craftworlds, die with the acceptance or the defiance or the resignation that dying's finality produces. The Drukhari die screaming. Not in pain, though the dying's pain is present, but in terror. The terror of Slaanesh, the terror of the consumption, the terror of the eternity the death provides. The screaming is the Drukhari's most honest sound, the sound the beings who inflict suffering on others produce when the suffering comes for them. Commorragh's military ecosystem extends far beyond the kobolds and the witch cults. The Dark City supports an array of warrior castes, mercenary orders, and mutated predators whose contributions to the Drukhari's military capability provide the diversity the raid's varied conditions demand. The Incubi are the Dark City's most feared warriors, an order of dedicated combatants, not a cabal, not a witch cult, not an organization with political ambitions or territorial interests. The Incubi exist for one purpose: the practice of close-quarters combat at the highest level the Aeldari's capabilities can produce. An incubus is a swordsman whose skill exceeds what most military cultures consider the upper boundary of individual combat capability, whose dedication to the martial art has consumed every other dimension of the incubus's existence, whose life is the blade and the blade's application. The incubi fight with claves, great two-handed power swords whose weight and whose reach exceed the weapons the witches carry, and whose damage profile reflects the incubi's preference for the decisive strike rather than the prolonged engagement. An incubus who engages an enemy does not duel the enemy. The incubus kills the enemy. The killing is conducted with the efficiency that the incubi's training produces, and the economy that the incubi's philosophy demands. No wasted movement, no unnecessary risk, no theatrical flourish that the Wick cult's arena traditions would prescribe. The incubi serve as mercenaries. The Order's warriors hire their services to the cabals and the Wick cults, providing the close combat capability the hiring cabal requires, and collecting the payment the service's provision demands. The incubi do not involve themselves in the Dark City's politics. The Order's independence is maintained through the strict neutrality the incubi's code prescribes. The incubi serve whoever pays them, fight whoever the payment directs them to fight, and withdraw when the contract's terms are fulfilled. Drazar is the incubi's greatest warrior and the Order's most enigmatic figure, the master of blades, the being whose combat capability exceeds every other incubus's by a margin the Order's own assessments describe as extraordinary, fights without speaking. Drazar does not communicate. The Master of Blades arrives at the engagement the contract specifies, kills the enemies the contract identifies, and departs without the verbal exchange that the Drukhari's culture normally accompanies every interaction. Drazar's identity is unknown. The armor the Master of Blades wears, the ancient, ornate incubus armor whose markings do not match any recorded set, conceals the being inside completely, and the being inside has never removed the armor in the presence of another Drukhari. Whether Drazar is a Drukhari, a Craftworld Aeldari, or something else entirely is debated within the incubi's order without resolution. because the resolution would require the Master of Blades' cooperation. And the Master of Blades does not cooperate with inquiries about the Master of Blades' identity. Some whisper that Drazar is a Phoenix Lord, one of the Craftworld Aeldari's legendary warriors, the founders of the aspect shrines whose consciousness is preserved through the armor they wore, and who manifest through the subsequent bearers of that armor. The whisper is not confirmed. The whisper produces questions that the Drukhari's culture does not encourage, and that the Incubi's code does not address. Drazar fights. Drazar kills. The fighting and the killing are the answers the Dark City receives, and the answers are sufficient. The mandrakes are Commorragh's most unsettling inhabitants, beings whose origin is debated even by the Drukhari's most knowledgeable scholars. The mandrakes may be Drukhari whose exposure to the webway's dimensional instability has transformed them into something partially demonic. Or they may be entities whose origin lies in the dimension between the webway and the warp, the shadow realm whose existence the webway's boundaries create. The mandrakes emerge from shadows. Not metaphorically, the mandrakes can step through shadows as though the shadows were doors, emerging from the darkness in locations the conventional physics of real space does not connect to the darkness the mandrakes entered. The movement is teleportation expressed through the medium of shadow, the mandrakes' transformed biology providing the capability the dimensional traversal requires. The mandrakes feed on pain in a more direct fashion than other Drukhari. The shadow beings absorb the suffering their kills produce through their skin, the psychic energy of the dying passing into the mandrake's body through contact, the absorption producing the balefire that the mandrakes hurl at their enemies from their hands. The mandrakes' weapons are the suffering they have consumed, converted into the flickering dark flame that the Drukhari call balefire, and that the mandrakes' victims call the last thing they see. The scourges are the Drukhari's aerial warriors, Drukhari whose bodies have been modified by the homunculi to include functional wings, the biological engineering providing the flight capability the scourge's tactical role demands. The modification is painful. The homunculi who graft the wings onto the scourge's body do not administer anesthesia. The pain of the grafting is part of the payment the homunculus extracts, and the scourge who undergoes the modification accepts the pain as the cost of the capability the modification provides. The scourges serve as Commorragh's messengers and as the raid's aerial support. The winged warriors carry communications between the Dark City's various factions. The message is too sensitive for the conventional channels the Dark City's monitoring systems intercept, and provide the air cover the raid's ground forces require during the real space operations. The Hellions are the Dark City's street gangs, the young, the reckless, the Drukhari whose position in Commorragh's hierarchy has not yet provided them with the Cabal membership or the witch cult enrollment the Dark City's standard career paths offer. The Hellions ride skyboards, anti-gravity platforms whose speed and agility provide the mobility the Hellions' hit-and-run tactics require. The Hellions are dangerous, not because the individual Hellion's combat capability exceeds the Kabbalite warriors or the witches. The Hellion's training is less comprehensive than either, because the Hellion's recklessness exceeds what the more established warriors display. A Hellion who attacks does not calculate the risk the way a Kabbalite warrior calculates. The Hellion attacks because the attacking is the Hellion's method of advancement, the demonstration of capability that the Cabals and the cult's recruiters evaluate. the audition for the career position the Hellions' Dark City existence requires. The Beastmasters provide the raids with their most exotic elements, the Xenos predators and the warp-bred horrors that the Beastmasters have captured, trained, and deployed alongside the Kabbalite forces. The Beastmasters ride flying platforms above their packs, directing the creature's attacks through the combination of pain stimuli and conditioning the Beastmasters' training methods employ. The razor-wing flocks, the flying predators whose razor-edged feathers produce the lacerating wounds the Beastmasters' charges are known for. The clawed fiends, the massive, multi-limbed beasts whose strength and aggression exceed what most infantry can withstand. The Commorragh, the shadow beasts whose partially demonic nature provides the warp-enhanced capabilities the material world's biology does not produce. The Dark City's military ecosystem is as diverse as it is lethal. The Cabals provide the organized military force. The witch cults provide the close combat specialists. The homunculi provide the flesh-crafted horrors. The incubi provide the precision killing. The mandrakes provide the shadow warfare. The scourges provide the aerial capability. The Hellions provide the reckless aggression. The Beastmasters provide the exotic predation. Together, the forces of Commorragh produce a combined arms capability that the Imperium's military analysts struggle to classify because the capability does not conform to the organizational standards the analysts' classification systems employ. The Drukhari do not fight like an army. The Drukhari fight like an ecosystem. Every element independent, every element lethal, every element contributing to the whole through the methods the element's nature provides, rather than through the coordination the whole's command structure imposes. The ecosystem hunts. The galaxy is the hunting ground. The raid begins before the victims know it is happening, and the not knowing is the raid's first cruelty. The Drukhari have been watching. The Dark City's intelligence apparatus, the spies, the surveillance systems, the Webway Gates observation capabilities, has been monitoring the target world for weeks or months, identifying the population centers, evaluating the defenses, assessing the quality of the captives the raid will produce. The quality matters. Not all suffering is equally nourishing. The suffering of a being whose emotional capacity is rich, whose psychology produces pain of the intensity the Drukhari's soul-feeding requires, is more valuable than the suffering of a being whose emotional range is diminished by training or by the numbness that harsh conditions produce. The Drukhari prefer humans, the Imperium's population, the trillions of human beings whose emotional range exceeds most Xenos species and whose cultural isolation makes them unaware of the threat the Drukhari represent, is the Dark City's primary source of captives. Humans feel deeply. Humans fear richly. Humans suffer with the intensity the Drukhari's metabolic requirements demand. The gate opens, not visibly. The Webway Gate's activation does not produce the dramatic visual effects that the warp's breaches generate. The gate opens quietly, in a location the surveillance has identified as suitable, an isolated area, a low population zone, a region whose distance from the world's military installations provides the time the raiders need before the world's defenses can respond. The vehicles emerge. The raiders, the anti-gravity transports whose speed and whose open-deck design provide the combination of mobility and deployment capability the raid's tempo requires, slide through the gate into the material universe with the silence that the anti-gravity propulsion produces. The vehicles carry the Kabbalite warriors, the witches, the specialist elements the raid's planning has assigned. The force is small, dozens of warriors, not hundreds. The Drukhari do not need hundreds. The speed is the substitute for numbers, and the speed exceeds what the target population's military can counter. The attack is instantaneous. The raiders accelerate from the gate to the target at speeds the human eye struggles to track. The vehicle's anti-gravity drives producing the velocity the Drukhari's combat doctrine demands. The warriors deploy from the vehicles while the vehicles are moving. The Kabbalite warriors dropping from the raiders' decks with the practiced ease of warriors who have conducted this maneuver thousands of times. The witches vaulting from the Venom's smaller platforms with the acrobatic grace the witch cult's training provides. The splinter weapons fire, the crystalline projectiles, the toxin-coated shards whose impact delivers the poisons the Drukhari's weaponsmiths have refined across millennia. Strike the target population's defenders with the precision the splinter weapons' accuracy provides. The defenders fall, not dead, but incapacitated. The toxins producing the pain and the paralysis the weapons are designed to deliver. The defenders who are killed by the splinter weapons' impacts are the raid's failures. The dead do not suffer, and the dead cannot be taken as captives. The melee elements close. The witches engage the remaining defenders at close range. The gladiatorial warriors' speed and agility producing the disabling strikes that the defenders' training cannot counter. The defenders are overwhelmed. Not by numbers, the Drukhari's force is smaller than the defenders' garrison. By speed, by capability, by the sheer violence that the Drukhari produce in quantities the defenders' experience has not prepared them for. The capturing begins. The Drukhari do not kill the population. The Drukhari collect the population. The surviving civilians, the beings who were not defending, who were not armed, who were engaged in the ordinary activities of their ordinary lives when the gate opened, are gathered by the Kabbalite warriors whose raiding experience has refined the gathering into a logistics exercise rather than a military operation. The gathering is efficient. The Drukhari have been doing this for 10,000 years. The methods are standardized. The herding, the restraining, the processing of large numbers of captives into the manageable groups the transportation through the webway gate requires. The civilians are bound. The civilians are drugged. The sedatives the Drukhari administer producing the compliance the transportation demands without the unconsciousness that the Drukhari prefer to avoid. Because the captive's awareness of what is happening to them produces the suffering the captive's unconsciousness would prevent. The captives are marched through the gate. The webway's tunnels carry the captives from the material universe to Commorragh. The transition from the world the captives knew to the dimension the captives will die in accomplished in the time the march through the gate's passage requires. The captives enter the Dark City. The Dark City is the last thing the captives will see that makes sense. The captives' subsequent experience, the processing, the assignment to the slave pens, the selection for the arenas or the homunculized laboratories or the private collections the Archons maintain, is the experience of beings whose reality has been replaced by the Drukhari's reality, and the replacement is permanent. The captive's suffering begins, not the suffering of the raid, the violence, the fear, the shock of the attack's immediacy, the suffering of the captivity, the sustained, managed, deliberately maintained agony that the Drukhari's civilization is designed to produce, and that the captive's body and mind will sustain for as long as the homunculized intervention can maintain the captive's life. The duration is measured in decades, A captive in Commorragh does not die quickly. The homunculized science, the biological expertise that sustains the subject's life through conditions that should produce death, extends the captive's existence far beyond the natural duration the captive species biology would permit. A human captive whose unassisted lifespan would be measured in decades can be sustained through the homunculized intervention for centuries. Centuries of suffering. The term is not rhetorical. The captives in Commorragh's slave pens and the homunculus laboratories endure for centuries, the pain maintained, the consciousness preserved, the body sustained against the body's own attempts to die, because the death would end the suffering, and the ending of the suffering would end the soul energy the suffering produces. This is the Drukhari's economy. The suffering is the product, the captives are the means of production, the raids are the supply chain. The entire civilization, the cabals, the witch cults, the homunculi covens, the dark city's infrastructure and its governance and its culture exists to produce and to distribute the suffering the civilization requires. The raid ends. The gate closes. The Drukhari return to Commorragh with their captives. The target world survivors, the beings who escaped the raid, who were not present in the target zone, who avoided the Drukhari's collection through the fortune that the escape required, discover the aftermath. The missing, the hundreds or thousands of people who were present hours ago and who are gone. The buildings whose damage marks the violence the raid produced. The silence that replaces the screaming the raid generated. The awareness, settling slowly into the survivor's consciousness with the weight of a truth the survivors did not know was possible, that the missing are not dead. The missing are in a place worse than death. And the missing are not coming back. The raid is over. The raid's consequences have just begun. The consequences will last for centuries. The slave does not understand what has happened. The last thing the slave remembers clearly is the morning on the world the slave called home, the hive world, the agricultural settlement, the frontier colony whose existence the Imperium's governance maintained, and whose population the Imperium's military was supposed to protect. The morning was ordinary. The slave was a citizen. The citizen was working, or eating, or conducting one of the routine activities that the citizen's ordinary existence comprised. The afternoon was not ordinary. The afternoon was the raid. The slave's memory of the raid is fragmented. The speed of the attack, the anti-gravity vehicles emerging from the empty air, the warriors deploying from the vehicle's open decks, the weapons whose crystalline projectiles produced pain the slave had not known the body was capable of experiencing. The slave fell. The toxin that the splinter weapon delivered produced a paralysis that the slave's body could not resist, and a pain that the slave's consciousness could not ignore. The slave was conscious. The slave could not move. The slave could feel. The dragging, the Drukhari warriors, the tall, angular, alien beings whose armor gleamed with a darkness the slave's visual cortex struggled to process, collected the slave alongside the other captives, binding the paralyzed bodies with restraints whose material the slave's hands could not identify, and whose construction the slave's comprehension could not encompass. The captives were loaded onto the vehicles. The vehicles moved. The world the slave had known vanished behind the vehicle's speed. The gate. The passage from the slave's reality to the Drukhari's. The transition from the material universe to the webway's dimensional space. the crossing conducted at a speed that prevented the slave from processing the crossing's significance. The world was gone. The sky was gone. The light, the ordinary, familiar, unremarkable light of the slave's homeworld sun was replaced by a light the slave's eyes had never been designed to perceive. Commorragh, the slave sees the dark city, and the seeing breaks something in the slave's understanding that the subsequent experience will not repair. The spires, the stolen suns, the impossible geometry of a city built in a dimension whose physics do not conform to the physics the slave's experience has established as normal. The city is beautiful. The beauty is the worst thing about the city, because the beauty is the beauty of a predator, the sleek, efficient, perfectly adapted form of a civilization, whose purpose is the consumption of beings like the slave. The processing is conducted with the efficiency of a system that has been optimized across 10,000 years of practice. The slave is evaluated, the body assessed for physical capability, the mind assessed for emotional range, the soul assessed for the quality of suffering the soul's depletion will produce. The evaluation determines the slave's assignment. The arenas, the homunculi's laboratories, the Archon's private collection, or the general slave pens whose captives serve the Dark City's infrastructure and maintenance needs. The slave pens are not the worst outcome. The slave assigned to the general pens, the captive whose evaluation has not identified qualities the specialized users require, serves the Dark City's ordinary labor needs. The construction, the maintenance, the menial work the Drukhari do not perform and that the slave population sustains. The labor is brutal. The conditions are appalling. The treatment is dehumanizing in the literal sense. The Drukhari do not regard the slaves as persons, and the not regarding produces the treatment the not regarding implies. The arenas are worse. The slave assigned to the arenas, the captive whose physical capability or whose emotional range the witch cult's evaluators have identified as suitable for the gladiatorial spectacle, faces the specific, sustained performative violence the arena culture produces. The slave fights. The slave loses. The slave's loss produces the suffering the arena's spectators require, and the suffering's production is the slave's purpose. The homunculi's laboratories are the worst. The slave assigned to a homunculus, the captive whose evaluation has identified qualities the flesh crafter's art requires, enters a condition the slave's prior experience has not prepared the slave to imagine. The homunculus does not simply inflict pain. The homunculus sculpts pain. The precise, controlled, scientifically informed application of stimuli whose effects the homunculus has calculated and whose duration the homunculus has planned across a timeline that extends for decades. The slave in the homunculus's laboratory does not die for a long time. The homunculus's science sustains the slave's body through conditions that the body's unassisted biology would have ended. The biological intervention preserving the consciousness through modifications that the consciousness would prefer the intervention had not provided. The slave screams in every assignment. The pens, the arenas, the laboratories, the slave screams. The screaming is the currency, the screaming is the product. The screaming is the energy the Drukhari absorb, the psychic resonance of the agony metabolized by the beings whose survival the agony sustains. The slave does not understand the metabolism. The slave does not understand that the screaming is being consumed, that the suffering is being converted into the soul energy the Drukhari require, that the slave's agony is the Dark City's food, The slave understands only the pain and the duration and the awareness that the duration will not end, because the beings who inflict the pain have the science to sustain the slave's existence past every point the slave's biology would have naturally concluded. The slave existed. The slave was a citizen. The citizen had a name, a life, a world. The slave is none of those things now. The slave is food. The food screams. The screaming feeds the dark city. The dark city lives on screams. The Drukhari and the Craftworld Aeldari are the same species. The sameness is the fact that makes the relationship between the two factions the most uncomfortable familial dynamic the galaxy produces. The Drukhari and the Craftworld populations are biologically identical. The same genetics, the same heightened senses, the same prodigious emotional range, the same psychic potential, though the Drukhari suppress theirs while the Craftworld populations develop theirs. The same vulnerability to Slaanesh, the same slow drain on the soul, the same curse that the fall produced, and that both populations manage through different methods. The methods are the difference. The Craftworld Aeldari manage the curse through discipline, the path system, the spirit stones, the infinity circuit, the structured suppression of the emotional excess that Slaanesh feeds on. The Drukhari manage the curse through indulgence, the raids, the suffering, the consumption of others' agony as the soul-sustaining fuel the survival requires. The Craftworld Aeldari regard the Drukhari with a complex mixture of revulsion and recognition. The revulsion is genuine. The Craftworld populations find the Drukhari's methods morally repugnant, the cruelty disgusting. The civilization's foundation on suffering an abomination that the Craftworld's ethical traditions condemn. The recognition is equally genuine. The Craftworld populations recognize, in the Drukhari, the potential that the Craftworld's discipline is designed to suppress. The Drukhari are what the Craftworld Aeldari would become if the discipline failed. The recognition produces the horror. The Craftworld Aeldari who contemplates the Drukhari is contemplating a mirror, a reflection of the self that discipline has prevented from manifesting. The unconstrained expression of the Aeldari's emotional and sensory capabilities that the path system's restraint is specifically designed to prevent. The Drukhari are the Craftworld Aeldari's shadow. The shadow is real. The shadow is alive. The shadow raids the galaxy and feeds on the suffering the raids produce, and refuses to apologize for the feeding, because the feeding is survival, and survival is the only value the shadow recognizes. The Drukhari regard the Craftworld Aeldari with contempt. The contempt is the Drukhari's characteristic response to the Craftworld's discipline, the assessment that the Craftworld populations have traded their freedom for safety, their emotional range for stability, their potential for the managed, constrained, aesthetically appealing but fundamentally diminished existence the path system prescribes. The Drukhari see the Craftworld Aeldari as prisoners. The path system is the cell. The spirit stones are the chains. The infinity circuit is the grave. The Craftworld Aeldari have imprisoned themselves in a system whose constraints prevent them from experiencing the full range of the Aeldari's emotional and sensory capabilities. And the imprisonment is voluntary. And the voluntariness makes the imprisonment worse than the involuntary kind, because the voluntary prisoner has chosen the cage. The Drukhari did not choose the cage. The Drukhari chose the wild, the unconstrained existence, the emotional freedom. the sensory intensity that the Aeldari's biology is designed to produce, and that the Craftworld's discipline is designed to suppress. The wild has a cost. The cost is the suffering the Drukhari inflict on others. The Drukhari accept the cost because the cost is external, borne by the slaves, the captives, the populations whose agony the Drukhari consume, rather than internal, borne by the Drukhari themselves through the self-imposed constraints the Craftworld populations accept. The two factions interact. Not frequently, not willing, but the galaxy's conditions produce the encounters the factions' mutual avoidance cannot prevent. Craftworld Aeldari who are captured by Drukhari raids are treated with a cruelty that exceeds what the Drukhari apply to other species captives, because the Craftworld captive's suffering is sweetened by the contempt the Drukhari feel for the captive's former restraint. The Craftworld Aeldari who captures a Drukhari warrior treats the captive with the same horror the Craftworld would direct at a daemon. The recognition that the captive's nature represents everything the Craftworld's discipline exists to prevent. The Ynnari, the faction dedicated to the god Ynnead's birth, have complicated the relationship. The Ynnari's purpose, the awakening of the Aeldari god of the dead, whose consciousness the Ynnari believe can destroy Slaanesh and free the Aeldari from the curse, requires the cooperation of all Aeldari factions, including the Drukhari. Yvraine, the Ynnari's prophet, whose pre-Ynnari career included time as a Drukhari witch in Commorragh's arenas, bridges the gap between the factions through her personal experience of both. The Drukhari's response to the Ynnari is hostile. The Ynnari's purpose, the destruction of Slaanesh, would eliminate the curse that produces the Drukhari's need for suffering. The elimination might seem like liberation. The Drukhari do not regard it as liberation. The Drukhari regard it as a threat. The destruction of the condition that justifies the Drukhari's civilization. The removal of the necessity that makes the cruelty necessary. If Slaanesh is destroyed, the Drukhari's reason for inflicting suffering vanishes, and the civilization the suffering sustains loses its foundational justification. The Drukhari do not want the cure. The Drukhari want the disease, because the disease is the excuse, and the excuse is the civilization's foundation. And the foundation's removal would require the civilization's reconstruction on a basis the Drukhari have spent 10,000 years ensuring does not exist. The Drukhari have become the disease. The beings who were afflicted by the curse have adopted the curse as their identity, and the adoption makes the cure the enemy rather than the salvation. The siblings face the same curse. The siblings chose different answers. The answers have produced different civilizations, different cultures, different relationships with the galaxy the siblings share. The Craftworld answer is discipline. The Drukhari answer is cruelty. Neither answer has destroyed the curse. Both answers have defined the beings who chose them. The Drukhari do not use psychic powers. The prohibition is absolute, universal, and enforced through the most direct possible method, the immediate execution of any Drukhari who violates it. The prohibition exists because the Aeldari's psychic nature is the vector through which Slaanesh's influence reaches them. The Aeldari's connection to the warp, the psychic bond that the species' biology produces, the sensitivity that the Old Ones engineered into the Aeldari's genetics, is the channel through which the Dark Prince hunts the Aeldari's souls. The psychic connection is the door. Slaanesh stands on the other side. Every use of psychic power opens the door wider. The Craftworld Aeldari use psychic powers despite the risk because the Craftworld's protective measures, the runes of warding, the spirit stones, the Farseer's disciplined channeling manage the risk's consequences. The Craftworld Aeldari open the door a crack, peek through and close it before Slaanesh can push through. The Drukhari refuse to open the door at all. The refusal is pragmatic. The Drukhari do not possess the Craftworld's protective measures. The spirit stones, the runes, the disciplined channeling, these are Craftworld technologies and traditions that the Drukhari's civilization does not maintain. A Drukhari who uses psychic power is a Drukhari who opens the door to Slaanesh without the protections the Craftworld provides. And the opening without the protections is suicide, the psychic connection blazing like a beacon in the warp. Drawing Slaanesh's attention directly to the Drukhari who used the power. A Drukhari psyker is a dead Drukhari. The psychic use draws Slaanesh. Slaanesh consumes the psyker's soul. The consumption is immediate, visible and terrifying, the Drukhari's body withering as the soul is drained. The psychic connection serving as the pipeline through which Slaanesh accelerates the drain from the slow, manageable flow the standard curse produces to the instantaneous catastrophic consumption the psychic use permits. The Drukhari who witness a psyker's consumption carry the witnessing as a warning, the visual evidence of what Slaanesh does to Drukhari who use the psychic capabilities the species biology provides. The warning reinforces the prohibition. The prohibition reinforces the survival. The survival depends on the prohibition's maintenance. The Drukhari compensate for the psychic prohibition through technology. The Dark City's engineers and the homunculi's biological scientists have developed alternatives that provide some of the capabilities the psychic powers would have offered. The dark matter weapons, the anti-gravity propulsion, the dimensional manipulation that the webway's physics permits. The technology is not a replacement for the psychic. The technology does not provide the prescience, the telepathy, the reality warping capabilities that the Craftworld Aeldari's Farseers wield. The technology provides approximations, alternatives, substitutes that address the specific tactical and strategic needs the psychic powers would have served. The prohibition produces a blind spot. The Drukhari, who refuse to use the warp's energies, are vulnerable to enemies who do use them. A psyker's assault, the directed psychic attack that the Imperium's librarians and the Craftworld's Farseers can produce, targets a vulnerability the Drukhari's technology does not fully address. The Drukhari's defenses against psychic attack are technological rather than psychic, and the technological defenses are less effective than the psychic defenses the Craftworld Aeldari maintain. The blind spot is accepted. The vulnerability the psychic prohibition produces is less dangerous than the vulnerability the psychic use would produce. Slaanesh's direct attention versus the enemy psyker's indirect attack. The Drukhari will accept the enemy psyker's bolt rather than invite Slaanesh's gaze. The prohibition defines the Drukhari's relationship with their own nature. The Aeldari are psychic beings. The psychic capability is embedded in the species' genetics, the heritage of the Old One's engineering that produced the Aeldari's creation. The Drukhari carry the capability. The Drukhari refuse to use it. The refusal is the Drukhari's most significant act of self-denial, the one restraint the beings who refused the Craftworld's restraints have accepted, the one limitation the beings who rejected limitations have imposed on themselves. The denial is the survival's price. The Drukhari who refuse to use their psychic capabilities are Drukhari who have accepted a constraint on their nature in exchange for the survival the constraint provides. The acceptance makes the Drukhari's rejection of the Craftworld's discipline incomplete. The Drukhari claim freedom from restraint. But the psychic prohibition is a restraint, and the restraint is the most fundamental the Drukhari maintain. The Drukhari do not acknowledge the contradiction. The prohibition is not discussed as a restraint. The prohibition is discussed as a survival measure, the practical response to the practical threat the psychic use produces. The framing is pragmatic rather than philosophical, and the pragmatism prevents the philosophical implications from being examined. The implications are the Drukhari are not as free as they claim. The beings who rejected the Craftworld's cage are in a cage of their own, a different cage. A cage whose walls are invisible and whose constraints are enforced through the fear of Slaanesh rather than through the discipline the Craftworld's culture prescribes. The Drukhari's cage is the psychic prohibition. The cage is as real as the Craftworld's path system. The cage is as constraining. The Drukhari just refuse to call it a cage. The Drukhari are among the most technologically advanced civilizations in the galaxy, and the advancement is directed toward purposes that the galaxy's other advanced civilizations would find appalling. The Aeldari's technological heritage, the legacy of 60 million years of civilizational development, the knowledge the pre-fall empire accumulated across an era that exceeded every other species' history, is preserved in the Drukhari's possession alongside the Craftworld populations. The Drukhari retained the Aeldari's technical knowledge when the fall separated the two populations, and the retention has been maintained across 10,000 years of subsequent development. The Drukhari have not stagnated. This is the difference between the Drukhari's technological condition and the Imperium's. Where the Imperium's technology has regressed from the Dark Age of Technology's peak, maintained through ritual rather than understanding, the Drukhari's technology has continued to develop. The Dark City's engineers and the homunculi's scientists innovate. New weapons are designed. New methods are developed. New applications of the Aeldari's inherited knowledge are produced through the experimental processes that the Drukhari's culture encourages. The encouragement is driven by the competition. The cabal's rivalry, the constant, vicious, creatively destructive competition between the Dark City's political military organizations produces the innovation pressure that the Imperium's conservative technology culture does not. An Archon whose cabal's weapons are inferior to a rival's weapons is an Archon whose raids produce fewer captives, whose status is diminished, whose position is threatened. The competition drives the improvement. The improvement produces the innovation. The innovation sustains the competition. The dark matter weapons are the Drukhari's most advanced armament. The Dark Lance, the anti-vehicle weapon whose destructive output rivals the Imperium's Lascannon in a package a fraction of the Lascannon's size and weight, uses dark matter manipulation to produce the destructive beam the weapon fires. The physics that the dark matter weapons employ exceed the Imperium's Mechanicus's understanding. The tech priests who have examined captured dark lances have not been able to determine the principles the weapons operate on, because the principles exceed the Mechanicus's theoretical model of the universe's physical laws. The anti-gravity technology is the Drukhari's most pervasive advancement. Every vehicle the Drukhari deploy, the Raiders, the Venoms, the Ravagers, the Reavers, the Hellion skyboards, uses anti-gravity propulsion, whose sophistication exceeds what the Imperium's own anti-gravity technology can produce. The Drukhari's vehicles are faster, more agile, more responsive than the Imperium's equivalents. The anti-gravity systems producing the performance the Drukhari's raiding doctrine demands. The poison technology is the Drukhari's most refined science. The venoms, the chemical and biological toxins the Drukhari apply to their weapons have been developed across 10,000 years of experimentation. Each generation of toxins more potent, more precisely targeted, more efficiently painful than the previous. The splinter weapons ammunition, the crystalline shards coated with the toxins the Drukhari's chemists have produced, delivers pain calibrated to the target species' nervous system. The toxin's formulation adjusted for the biology of the species the raid has targeted. The homunculus' biological science exceeds every other civilization's capability in the specific domain the homunculi occupy, the manipulation of living flesh. The fleshcrafter's understanding of biology, the Aeldari's inherited knowledge refined through 10,000 years of practical application to living subjects, permits modifications the Imperium's medical sciences cannot replicate. The growth of new organs, the regeneration of destroyed tissue, the reconstruction of damaged bodies, the resurrection of the dead. The resurrection technology is the homunculi's most significant achievement, and the achievement that gives the Covens their institutional power. The ability to reverse death, to recall a soul from Slaanesh's grasp and reinstall it in a reconstructed body, is a technological capability that no other civilization in the galaxy possesses. The Mechanicus cannot resurrect the dead. The Craftworld Aeldari cannot resurrect the dead. The Imperium's medical sciences cannot reverse the death the homunculi routinely reverse. The capability's exclusivity is the homunculi's power's source. The Drukhari who know the homunculi can reverse death are Drukhari who treat the homunculi with the deference the capability demands, because the deference is the price of the service the capability provides. The soul-trapping technology is the Drukhari's most important non-military advancement. The devices the Drukhari use to capture and contain the psychic resonance of suffering, the agony siphons installed on the vehicles, the pain engines collection systems, the arena's distributed absorption infrastructure convert the raw suffering the raids and the arenas produce into the consumable soul energy the Drukhari's feeding requires. The technology has been refined across millennia of optimization. The current generation's agony siphons are more efficient than the previous generations, capturing a higher percentage of the suffering's psychic resonance, converting the resonance to consumable energy with less waste, distributing the energy to the consumers with greater precision. The refinement is driven by the same competition that drives the weapon's improvement. The Cabal, whose vehicles' agony siphons are more efficient, captures more soul energy per raid, and the greater capture sustains the Cabal's members more effectively. The Drukhari's technology is the civilization's inheritance and the civilization's creation. The Aeldari's 60 million year legacy combined with the Drukhari's 10,000 year refinement to produce the most advanced technology of suffering the galaxy has ever produced. The technology works. The technology evolves. The technology serves the purpose the civilization's survival demands. The purpose is suffering. The technology is very good at producing it. What does it mean to be Drukhari? The question is worth asking because the Drukhari are typically described through the lens of their victims, the suffering the Drukhari produce, the horrors the Drukhari civilization sustains, the experience of the beings who are on the receiving end of the Drukhari's metabolic necessity. The victim's perspective is important. The Drukhari's perspective is also important, because the perspective reveals something the victim's lens does not capture. The Drukhari's existence is not comfortable. A Drukhari lives in fear. Not the ordinary fear that mortal beings experience, the manageable, proportional, circumstance-dependent fear that the galaxy's general conditions produce. The existential fear of a being whose soul is being consumed by a god, whose appetite is permanent, and whose patience is infinite. Every Drukhari at every moment of every day feels the drain, the slow, persistent, never-stopping pull of Slaanesh on the soul, the Dark Prince's hunger reaching through the warp to touch the being whose ancestors created the hunger's source. The drain is not metaphorical. The Drukhari experience the drain as a physical sensation, a coldness, a hollowness, a feeling of diminishment that the feeding's replenishment temporarily addresses, but that the feeding's cessation immediately restores. A Drukhari who has recently fed, who has attended the arenas, who has participated in a raid, who has personally inflicted the suffering the feeding requires, feels whole, vital, present. The sensation of wholeness is the Drukhari's version of a full meal, and the fullness is temporary, because the drain resumes the moment the feeding stops. A Drukhari who has not fed recently feels empty. The emptiness is the drain's accumulated effect, the soul energy depleted by Slaanesh's continuous consumption, the vitality reduced, the youth that the Aeldari's biology should sustain beginning to fade. The emptiness is the fear's source, because the emptiness is the preview of the withering, and the withering is the preview of the death, and the death is Slaanesh's consumption of the soul. The fear drives everything. The raids are driven by the fear, the necessity of replenishing the soul energy the drain depletes, the urgency of the feeding that the emptiness produces. The politics are driven by the fear, the competition for the resources the feeding requires, the status seeking that places the Drukhari in position to access the suffering the feeding demands. The cruelty is driven by the fear, the infliction of agony that the feeding's mechanism requires, the suffering produced not for pleasure but for survival. The pleasure is real. The Drukhari enjoy the cruelty. The enjoyment is not a moral choice. It is a conditioned response. The biological reward that the feeding's act produces in the Drukhari's nervous system. A Drukhari who feeds, who inflicts suffering, who absorbs the psychic resonance of the agony, experiences pleasure. The pleasure is the biology's confirmation that the feeding has occurred, the nervous system's signal that the soul energy has been replenished, the reward that the body provides for the behavior the survival requires. The pleasure has become an addiction. Across 10,000 years of feeding, the Drukhari's relationship with the pleasure the feeding produces has evolved from the survival response the biology intended into the compulsive behavior the biology did not anticipate. The Drukhari do not simply feed because they must. They feed because they want to. The wanting has exceeded the needing. The pleasure has exceeded the nutrition. The cruelty has exceeded the survival requirement and has become the pursuit of sensation that the pre-fall Aeldari conducted through different means but with the same underlying motivation. The Drukhari are repeating the pattern. The beings who survived the fall, who escaped the consequences of the Aeldari Empire's pursuit of sensation, are pursuing sensation through different channels but with the same compulsive quality that produced the fall. The feeding's pleasure is the pleasure cult's pleasure redirected. The same neurological response, the same addiction, the same inability to stop that the pre-fall Aeldari demonstrated, and that the post-fall Drukhari are demonstrating through the medium of others' suffering rather than through the medium of personal indulgence. The Drukhari know this. The Dark City's culture does not suppress the awareness. The Drukhari are not blind to the pattern the awareness reveals. The Drukhari see the pattern. The Drukhari acknowledge the pattern. The Drukhari continue the pattern because the pattern is the survival, and the survival is the only value the pattern's continuation serves. The alternative is the Craftworld's discipline. The Drukhari have considered the alternative and rejected it, not because the alternative is unworkable, but because the alternative is unbearable. The Drukhari's nature, the heightened emotional range, the sensory intensity, the capacity for experience that the Aeldari's biology provides, produces a being for whom the Craftworld's restraint is a form of death. The Drukhari would rather feed on suffering than live in the constrained, managed, disciplined existence the Craftworld prescribes. The preference is the Drukhari's most honest expression. The Drukhari prefer suffering to discipline. The preference is the choice that defines the civilization, expressed through every institution the civilization maintains, sustained through every generation the civilization produces. The preference does not make the Drukhari happy. The Dark City's inhabitants are not happy beings. The fear, the constant, underlying, never-resolved fear of Slaanesh's consumption, prevents the happiness the pleasure might otherwise produce. A Drukhari who experiences the feeding's pleasure experiences the pleasure against the background of the fear, and the background diminishes the pleasure's quality in the way that eating a meal while standing on the edge of a cliff diminishes the meal's enjoyment. The Drukhari live on the edge of the cliff. The cliff is Slaanesh. The meal is suffering. The eating is survival. The enjoyment is present but compromised. The compromise is the Drukhari's existence. The beings whose ancestors created the cliff are eating on the cliff's edge forever, because the alternative is falling, and the falling is consumption, and the consumption is the end. The Drukhari do not fall. The Drukhari eat. The eating sustains the standing. The standing sustains the eating. The cliff does not go away. The cliff never goes away. The Imperium of Man is the Drukhari's primary hunting ground, and the hunting has been conducted for 10,000 years without the Imperium developing an effective counter. The Imperium's inability to prevent the Drukhari's raids is not a failure of military capability. The Imperium's military forces, the Imperial Guards regiments, the Space Marine chapters, the Imperial Navy's fleets are individually capable of engaging and defeating the Drukhari's raiding forces in direct combat. The individual engagement is not the problem. The problem is that the Drukhari do not engage in direct combat. The Drukhari raid. The raid's entire operational doctrine is designed to prevent the direct engagement the Imperium's forces could win. The Drukhari emerge from the webway gate, conduct the operation at a tempo the defenders cannot match, and withdraw through the gate before the defenders can bring their superior numbers to bear. The engagement's duration, hours, not days or weeks, is shorter than the response time the Imperium's military coordination requires. By the time the nearest Imperial Guard garrison receives the alert, the Drukhari are gone. By the time the garrison mobilizes, the webway gate has closed. By the time the Imperial Response Force arrives at the raid's location, the location is empty, the captives taken, the raiders departed, the only evidence of the Drukhari's presence the missing people and the damage the raid produced. The Imperium cannot close the webway gates. The gates are Aeldari technology, the Old One's construction, maintained by the Aeldari's webway mastery across 60 million years of use. The Imperium does not understand the gate's operating principles. The Imperium cannot detect the gates before they open. The Imperium cannot block the gate's activation. The Imperium cannot seal the gates after they close. The gates are invisible until they are used and inaccessible after the using is complete. The invisibility is the Drukhari's strategic advantage. The Imperium's military doctrine is designed for the engagement of visible enemies. Enemies whose approach can be detected, whose forces can be assessed, whose intentions can be anticipated through the intelligence the Imperium's apparatus provides. The Drukhari are not visible until the gate opens, and the gate opens at the moment the raid begins, and the raid is over before the visibility has produced the response the Imperium's doctrine prescribes. The Imperium has tried to prevent the raids. The Death Watch, the Inquisition's Xenos hunting Astartes formation, has conducted counter-Drukhari operations that have produced some successes. The Death Watch's intelligence network has identified some webway gates locations, and the deployments the identification produces have allowed the Death Watch to ambush the Drukhari's raiders at the gate's exit points. The ambushes are effective when they occur. The ambushes are rare, because the webway gates locations are numerous, and the Death Watch's resources are finite. The Imperium's civilian population bears the raid's cost. The hive cities, the agricultural worlds, the frontier settlements whose populations the Drukhari's intelligence apparatus has identified as suitable targets. These populations live in the perpetual, unacknowledged, culturally suppressed awareness that the disappearances the occasional raids produce are not the natural attrition the Administratum's reports describe. The Imperium does not tell its population about the Drukhari. The knowledge of the Dark Eldar, the awareness that a civilization of sadistic raiders is conducting systematic harvesting of the Imperium's population for the purpose of suffering-based soul sustenance, is not information the Imperium's governance considers useful for the population to possess. The disappearances are classified as criminal activity, as frontier casualties, as the statistical losses the Imperium's vast population produces through the ordinary processes of a galaxy at war. The classification is a lie. The Imperium knows the Drukhari exist. The Inquisition's Ordo Xenos, the branch dedicated to Xenos threats, maintains files on the Drukhari's activities that span millennia of documentation. The files describe the raid's patterns, the gate's known locations, the methods the Drukhari employ, the populations the Drukhari favor. The files do not produce effective countermeasures, because the countermeasures the files suggest, the permanent monitoring of every known webway gate, the garrisoning of every potential target world with forces capable of responding to the raid's tempo, would require resources the Imperium cannot provide. The raids are a tax. The Imperium pays the tax in people. The thousands of citizens the Drukhari's raids extract from the Imperium's population annually, the human beings whose suffering sustains the Dark City's inhabitants' souls. The tax is not acknowledged. The tax is not quantified. The tax is not discussed in the Imperium's governance councils, because the discussion would require the acknowledgement that the Imperium cannot prevent the extraction, and the acknowledgement would undermine the Imperium's claim to the protection of its citizens. The Imperium protects its citizens from many threats. The Imperium does not protect its citizens from the Drukhari, because the Drukhari's operational methods exceed what the Imperium's defensive capabilities can counter. The people disappear. The reports classify the disappearances. The classification conceals the reality. The reality is that the Drukhari have been harvesting the Imperium's population for 10,000 years, and the Imperium has not found a way to stop them, and the Imperium may never find a way to stop them. Because the Webway's technology exceeds the Imperium's understanding, and the Drukhari's speed exceeds the Imperium's response. The hunting continues. The prey does not know it is prey. The predator does not care. The Imperial commander receives the report, and the report's contents produce a reaction the commander's training did not prepare for. Xenos Raiders. Dark Eldar. The words in the report are the words every Imperial military commander in the frontier sectors fears, because the words describe a threat the commander's forces cannot effectively counter, and that the commander's tactical doctrine does not adequately address. The commander knows the Drukhari. Not from personal experience, few Imperial commanders encounter the Drukhari and retain the memory from the briefings. The classified files the Ordo Xenos provides to the senior officers whose commands include the sectors the Drukhari's known raiding patterns affect. The briefings describe the threat in the clinical language the military's intelligence apparatus employs, but the clinical language does not conceal the content's horror. The briefing says, "The enemy is faster than your forces. The anti-gravity vehicles the Drukhari deploy move at speeds your ground vehicles cannot match. The enemy will close the distance before your heavy weapons can engage. The enemy will be among your troops before your troops can form the defensive positions your doctrine prescribes." The briefing says, "The enemy's weapons are designed to produce pain rather than death. The splinter weapons fire toxin-coated projectiles whose impact incapacitates through agony. Your soldiers who are hit will not die immediately. They will be in pain. The pain will affect the morale of the soldiers who witness the hit soldiers' suffering. The morale effect is the enemy's tactical tool." The briefing says, "The enemy does not want to kill your soldiers. The enemy wants to capture them. The killed soldier is a failure for the Drukhari. The captured soldier is a success. Your defensive planning must account for an enemy whose objective is not the destruction of your force but the seizure of your force's personnel." The briefing says the engagement will last hours at most. The enemy will emerge from a portal whose location you cannot predict. The enemy will conduct the operation at a tempo your response times cannot match. The enemy will withdraw through the portal before your reinforcements arrive. By the time your response force reaches the engagement's location, the enemy will be gone, and your personnel will be gone with them. The commander reads the briefing. The commander does not sleep well after reading the briefing. The raid arrives at the time, and the location the briefing's worst scenario describes, without warning, at a point the commander's defensive disposition has not prioritized, at a speed the commander's reaction protocols cannot match. The vehicles appear. Not on the horizon, not approaching from a distance the sensors have detected and the response has addressed. The vehicles appear from nothing. From the portal the Drukhari have opened in the empty air above the outskirts of the settlement the raid has targeted. The vehicles are already moving. The vehicles are already fast. The vehicles are among the settlement's structures before the commander's communications systems have transmitted the alert. The commander orders the response. The garrison mobilizes. The soldiers move to the positions the defensive plan prescribes. The heavy weapons deploy. The vehicle squadrons prepare to engage. The soldiers reach their positions and discover the Drukhari are already past the positions. The enemy's speed has carried the raiders through the defensive cordon before the cordon's completion. The heavy weapons cannot engage targets that are already behind the weapons' firing arcs. The vehicle squadrons cannot pursue enemies whose anti-gravity drives outpace the squadron's treaded vehicles by orders of magnitude. The engagement is not a battle. A battle implies the mutual engagement of forces whose capabilities produce a contested outcome. The raid is not contested. The Drukhari are faster. The Drukhari are more agile. The Drukhari strike the settlement's civilian population with a precision that the commander's forces cannot interrupt, because the forces cannot reach the engagement's location at the speed the engagement demands. The civilians are taken. The commander watches, through the command post's surveillance systems, through the reports the forward observers transmit, through the communications that the engagement's chaos produces, as the Drukhari's warriors collect the settlement's inhabitants with the efficiency of a harvesting operation. The collection is systematic. The Drukhari move through the settlement's structures with the practiced ease of warriors who have conducted this operation countless times, gathering the civilians, restraining them, transporting them toward the portal's location. The commander orders the counterattack. The garrison's forces, the soldiers whose positions the Drukhari bypassed, the vehicles whose speed the Drukhari outpaced, converge on the portal's location. The convergence is too late. The Drukhari's warriors are already withdrawing, the vehicles loading the last captives, the raiding force collapsing toward the portal with the coordinated precision the withdrawal's tempo demands. The portal closes. The Drukhari are gone. The captives are gone. The settlement's population, or the portion of the population the Drukhari's collection harvested, is gone. Taken through the portal into a dimension the commander's forces cannot reach, and from which the captives will never return. The commander files the report. The report describes the engagement in the military's language, the timeline, the force dispositions, the outcome. The report does not describe the commander's feeling. The report does not capture the commander's awareness that the engagement's outcome was determined before the engagement began, because the Drukhari's speed and the portal's unpredictability produced conditions the commander's forces could not address. The report recommends improvements: better surveillance, faster response times, heavier weapons positioned at the settlement's perimeter. The recommendations are filed. The improvements are implemented. The next raid ignores the improvements. The next portal opens at a different location. The next engagement follows the same pattern. The speed, the collection, the withdrawal, the portal closing before the response arrives. The commander files another report. The report's recommendations are different this time. The commander has learnt what the briefing's clinical language did not convey. The Drukhari cannot be stopped through the methods the commander's doctrine provides. The Drukhari can only be survived. The survivors file reports. The reports recommend improvements. The improvements are implemented. The Drukhari adapt. The cycle continues. The commander does not sleep well. The Great Rift has produced the most significant crisis in Commorragh's 10,000-year history, and the crisis threatens the Dark City's existence in ways that Drukhari's internal politics have never managed to produce. The Cicatrix Maledictum's formation, a galaxy-spanning warp storm that tore real space in half after Cadia's fall, has affected Commorragh's dimensional stability. The webway's walls, the barriers that separate the webway's dimensional space from the warp's unrestricted influence, have been weakened by the rift's proximity. The weakening has produced an acceleration of the null zone formation that was already eroding Commorragh's habitable space. The regions where the webway's dimensional integrity is broken down, and the warp's entities can breach the barrier. The disjunction was the crisis's most violent expression. A catastrophic breach in Commorragh's dimensional walls, the largest null zone event in the Dark City's recorded history, produced a demonic incursion within the webway itself. The daemons poured through the breach into Commorragh's infrastructure, attacking the Dark City's population with the fury that demonic entities bring to every engagement with the material world's inhabitants. The disjunction produced chaos. Not the metaphorical chaos of political disruption, the literal chaos of demonic entities rampaging through Commorragh's streets, killing Drukhari, destroying infrastructure, threatening the Dark City's continued existence as a habitable environment. The Drukhari fought back. The Cabal's mobilist. The witch cults took the field. The homunculi unleashed their creations. The combined forces of Commorragh's military ecosystem engaged the demonic incursion with the desperation that the existential threat produced. Vect exploited the crisis. The supreme overlord, whose political instincts exceed every other being's in the Dark City, used the disjunction as an opportunity to eliminate rivals whose destruction the ordinary political methods had not achieved. Vect's enemies, the Archons and the noble houses whose opposition to the Black Heart's dominance had been sustained through the political maneuvering the Dark City's culture produces, found themselves fighting on two fronts: the demonic incursion and Vect's forces. The two threats coordinated through the Overlord's manipulation of the crisis's conditions. Vect may have allowed the disjunction to occur. The accusation is not confirmed. The evidence is circumstantial. The Drukhari's culture does not produce the transparent investigations the accusation's confirmation would require. But the accusation is widely believed within Commorragh's population. Because the accusation is consistent with Vect's demonstrated methods, the exploitation of catastrophe for political advantage, the willingness to endanger the Dark City's population if the endangering serves the Overlord's purposes. The accusation, if true, means that Vect permitted a demonic incursion within Commorragh, the most dangerous event the Dark City can experience, the one threat that exceeds every internal political crisis and every external military challenge, as a tool for the elimination of political rivals. The scale of the gamble is consistent with Vect's character. The Overlord who lured an Imperial battleship into Commorragh to destroy his rivals has demonstrated the willingness to risk the Dark City's existence for the advantage the risk produces. The disjunction was contained. The demonic incursion was suppressed. The combined forces of Commorragh's military driving the daemons back through the breach. The breach sealed through the efforts of the Dark City's engineers and the dimensional manipulation the webway's physics permits. The containment came at a cost: Drukhari casualties, infrastructure destruction, the loss of habitable space within the Dark City that the Null Zone's expansion has not been reversed. Vect emerged from the disjunction stronger. The rivals the crisis had eliminated were not replaced. The Blackheart's dominance was reaffirmed. The Overlord's control over Commorragh was consolidated through the crisis's exploitation in the manner the accusation suggests and that the outcome confirms. The era Indomitus has produced additional pressures on Commorragh. The webway's overall stability has declined. The Great Rift's influence on the dimensional barriers that separate the webway from the warp, producing a general weakening that affects Commorragh's infrastructure alongside the broader webway's passages. The gates that connect Commorragh to the material universe have become less reliable, some gates closing permanently, others becoming unstable. The Dark City's connection to its hunting grounds degrading in ways the Drukhari's engineers are struggling to address. The degradation threatens the raids. The Drukhari's survival depends on the raids, the expeditions into realspace that produce the captives whose suffering sustains the Dark City's population. If the gates fail, if the connections between Commorragh and the material universe are severed by the webway's degradation, the Drukhari lose access to the prey the survival requires. The Dark City's population, cut off from the suffering the raids provide, would begin to wither, the souls draining, the immortality failing, the population aging and dying as Slaanesh's appetite consumes the soul energy the feeding cessation has stopped replenishing. The prospect is the Drukhari's worst nightmare. The beings whose civilization is built on the avoidance of Slaanesh's consumption face the possibility that the civilization's infrastructure, the webway, the gates, the connections to the material universe, may eventually fail, and the failure would produce the consumption the civilization was built to prevent. The Drukhari are fighting the degradation. The Dark City's engineers, the Homunculus' biological scientists, the Cabal's military forces, all are directed at the maintenance of the gate's connections, the stabilization of the webway's walls, the preservation of the infrastructure the survival requires. The effort is sustained but insufficient. The degradation exceeds the repair, and the repair's rate is not accelerating fast enough to match the degradation's pace. The Dark City is losing ground, not to a military enemy, to a structural condition that the Drukhari's technology cannot fully address, and that the Drukhari's culture does not produce the long-term planning to manage. The immediate crises consume the attention. The immediate threats consume the resources. The long-term degradation continues beneath the immediate, eroding the foundation the immediate is built on. Commorragh endures. The Dark City has endured for 10,000 years, through internal wars and demonic incursions and political upheavals whose intensity would have destroyed a less resilient civilization. The endurance is the Drukhari's most significant quality, the capacity to survive conditions that the condition's intensity suggests should be unsurvivable. But the endurance is being tested by conditions the Drukhari have not previously faced. The galaxy's darkening, the rift's expansion, the webway's degradation, the gate's unreliability, is producing a strategic landscape in which the Drukhari's survival methods may not be sustainable. The Dark City stands, the raids continue, the suffering flows. For now. The "for now" is the most frightening phrase in the Drukhari's vocabulary. The beings who have lived for 10,000 years through the infliction of suffering are facing the possibility that the 10,000 years may have an end. The end is not certain. The Drukhari's resilience argues against it. The webway's degradation argues for it. The argument continues. The Dark City stands while the argument is unresolved. The Drukhari are the 41st millennium's most uncomfortable mirror, and the mirror reflects a truth the galaxy's other civilizations prefer not to see. The truth is this: the Drukhari are what any species becomes when survival requires the suffering of others and the species chooses to survive. The Imperium of man does not feed on suffering. Not in the metabolic sense the Drukhari employ, but the Imperium sustains itself through the labor and the death of its population with a callousness that the Drukhari's explicit cruelty does not exceed in scale. The Imperium's hive worlds consume their populations with the same indifference the Drukhari's slave pens display. The Imperium's military expenditures, the billions of Imperial Guard soldiers who die in the galaxy's wars, the populations who are sacrificed through exterminatus when the military's assessment determines the sacrifice serves the Imperium's interests, are the Imperium's version of the Drukhari's raids, conducted at a larger scale and justified through a different moral vocabulary. The Drukhari do not pretend. This is the mirror's most uncomfortable reflection. The Drukhari do not justify their cruelty through the moral language that the Imperium employs to justify its own. The Drukhari do not claim that the suffering they inflict serves a higher purpose. The Drukhari do not wrap the cruelty in the rhetoric of duty, of sacrifice, of the greater good that the Imperium's governance uses to justify the expenditure of human lives. The Drukhari are honest. The honesty is monstrous. The Drukhari acknowledge that their survival requires the suffering of others, and the acknowledgement is not accompanied by the moral discomfort that the acknowledgement might produce in a species whose culture maintained the pretense that suffering is regrettable. The Drukhari do not regret the suffering. The Drukhari consume the suffering. The consumption is the purpose. The purpose is the survival. The survival is the only value the Drukhari recognize. The honesty's monstrousness is the mirror's power. The galaxy's other civilizations, the Imperium, the Tau Empire, the Craftworld Aeldari, maintain the moral vocabularies that allow them to describe their own cruelties in terms that distinguish their cruelties from the Drukhari's. The Imperium calls its cruelty duty. The Tau call their cruelty the greater good. The Craftworld Aeldari call their cruelty necessity. The moral vocabularies provide the conceptual distance between the cruelty the speakers commit and the cruelty the speakers condemn. The Drukhari do not provide the distance. The Drukhari's cruelty is undisguised. The Drukhari's purpose is unambiguous. The Drukhari's relationship with the suffering they produce is transparent. The suffering is the food. The food sustains the life. The life requires the food. The transparency makes the Drukhari the galaxy's monsters, and the monstrousness is the product of the transparency rather than of the cruelty's scale. The Drukhari represent the refusal to change. The Aeldari who caused the fall, who produced the excess that created Slaanesh, whose behavior destroyed their civilization, refused to alter the behavior. The Drukhari's response to the catastrophe was not reformation. It was adaptation, the retention of the behavior's essential quality with the modification of the behavior's target. The Drukhari adapted without changing. The adaptation is the survival. The survival does not require the change the Craftworld populations adopted. Whether the Drukhari's adaptation is superior to the Craftworld's reformation is the question the two populations' existence poses to each other across 10,000 years of mutual contempt. The Craftworld answer is clear. The Reformation is superior because the Reformation does not require the suffering of others. The Drukhari answer is equally clear. The adaptation is superior because the adaptation does not require the suppression of the self. Both answers are valid within the worldview the answerers maintain. Both answers produce civilizations that survive. Both answers carry costs that the answerers accept and that the alternatives advocates reject. The Drukhari's cost is the suffering they inflict. The Craftworld's cost is the freedom they surrender. Neither cost is eliminated by the other's endorsement or the other's condemnation. The Drukhari represent the freedom that has no morality. The beings who refused the Craftworld's cage are free. Free to feel, free to experience, free to pursue the sensations the Aeldari's biology provides. The freedom is real. The freedom is also monstrous, because the freedom's exercise requires the suffering of others, and the freedom's maintenance requires the suffering's continuation, and the freedom's value is assessed by the beings who enjoy it, rather than by the beings who sustain it. The slaves who sustain the Drukhari's freedom did not choose the sustaining. The captives whose suffering feeds the Dark City's population were not consulted about the feeding. The beings whose agony the Drukhari consume are the freedom's cost, paid by beings whose consent was not sought and whose objections are not heard. The Drukhari's freedom is the galaxy's most selfish freedom. The freedom that is purchased entirely at others' expense. The freedom that recognizes no obligation to the beings whose suffering the freedom requires. The freedom that the Drukhari claim as their right, and that the Drukhari's victims would describe, if the victims' descriptions were sought, in terms that would not include the word freedom at all. The mirror reflects. The galaxy looks away. The Drukhari do not look away. The Drukhari look into the mirror and see themselves clearly and do not flinch from the seeing, because the flinching would be the beginning of the change the Drukhari refuse. The refusal is the Drukhari's identity. The refusal is the Drukhari's civilization. The refusal is the Drukhari's answer to the question the Fall posed to every surviving Aeldari. Will you change? The Craftworld Aeldari said yes. The Drukhari said no. 10,000 years later, neither answer has produced happiness. Neither answer has eliminated the curse. Neither answer has destroyed Slaanesh. Both answers have produced civilizations that survive. Both civilizations carry the curse. The difference is who else carries the cost. Somewhere in the Dark City, a Drukhari is hungry. The hunger is not physical, not the stomach's demand for food that biological processes produce. The hunger is spiritual. The hunger is the soul's depletion, the drain that Slaanesh's continuous consumption produces, the slow emptying that the Dark Prince's appetite imposes on every Aeldari whose existence the Dark Prince claims. The Drukhari feels the hunger, the emptiness that the feeding's absence produces, the coldness that the soul's depletion generates in the body the soul inhabits, the awareness, settling into the consciousness with the familiar weight of a sensation the Drukhari has experienced 10,000 times before, that the feeding is overdue, and that the overdue's continuation will produce the withering, and the withering will produce the death, and the death will produce Slaanesh's consumption. The Drukhari goes to the arena. The amphitheater is vast, the seating rising in tiers above the killing floor. The spectators' seats filled with Drukhari whose hunger matches the Drukhari's own, the collective attendance produced by the collective need the hunger represents. The spectators are hungry. The arena feeds them. The gates open. The slaves are released. The captives taken from a world the Drukhari's raiders visited weeks ago. The human beings whose lives on their homeworld were ordinary. and whose lives in Commorragh are measured in the suffering the arena produces. The slaves are armed. Not effectively. The weapons the arena provides are insufficient for the threats the slaves will face. The arming conducted not to provide the slaves with a genuine chance of survival, but to provide the spectacle with the element of resistance the audience demands. The witches enter. The gladiators whose training has produced the combat mastery the arena celebrates, whose drug-enhanced speed and reflexes exceed what the slave's natural capabilities can match, whose weapons are the implements of an art the arena's culture has refined across millennia of practice. The witches are beautiful. The beauty is the Aeldari's inheritance, the physical grace the species' genetics provide, expressed through the combat's choreography with the aesthetic sophistication the witch cult's traditions prescribe. The killing begins. The witches engage the slaves with the measured artistry the arena demands. The strikes calibrated to produce maximum suffering without immediate death. The wounds inflicted in patterns the audience recognizes as the witch's signature style. The killing conducted as performance, the death delivered as entertainment. The spectators feed the psychic resonance of the suffering, the agony the slaves produce as the witches' weapons find the body's sensitive structures radiates through the arena, absorbed by the spectators' depleted souls, the absorption producing the replenishment the hunger demanded. The Drukhari in the stands feels the feeding's warmth, the soul energy restored, the depletion reversed. The withering's approach halted by the suffering the arena has provided. The Drukhari is full. For now. The fullness is temporary. The hunger will return tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that, depending on the feeding's quantity and the drain's intensity and the individual's metabolism's rate. The hunger always returns. The feeding is never final. The cycle, the hunger, the feeding, the fullness, the hunger is the Drukhari's existence, repeated daily, sustained across millennia, the rhythm of a life whose continuation depends on the rhythm's maintenance. The slaves are dead, some of them. The survivors, the beings whose injuries the arena's combat produced, but whose deaths the combat did not achieve, are removed from the killing floor and returned to the slave pens, where the homunculized science will sustain them until the next arena session requires their presence. The Drukhari leaves the arena, the dark city's streets, the sprawl's crowded passages, the spire's elevated walkways, the transit corridors whose anti-gravity vehicles carry the population between the city's vertical layers, receive the Drukhari's passage with the indifference the city's population extends to every individual whose presence is neither threatening nor profitable. The Drukhari returns to the Cabal's quarters, the warrior's residence, the space the Cabal's membership provides, the quarters whose quality reflects the warrior's status within the Cabal's hierarchy. The quarters are comfortable. The comfort is the Cabal's payment for the warrior's service, the participation in the raids, the contribution to the Cabal's military operations, the commitment to the Archon's directives that the Cabal's membership demands. The Drukhari rests. Not peacefully, the Dark City does not produce peaceful rest, because the Dark City's conditions do not permit the trust the peaceful rest requires. The Drukhari rests with the awareness that the quarter's walls do not guarantee safety, that the Cabal's hierarchy produces the rivalries the quarter's proximity intensifies, that the rest is the vulnerable period the Drukhari's enemies might exploit. The Drukhari dreams. The dream is the one dream every Drukhari experiences. The dream of Slaanesh. The Dark Prince's presence in the Drukhari's sleeping consciousness, the god's hunger pressing against the soul's defenses during the sleep's reduced vigilance, the awareness that the being who hunts the Drukhari does not sleep, and does not rest, and does not pause the hunting for the convenience of the hunted. The Drukhari wakes. The hunger is returning. The feeding's replenishment is beginning to fade. The drain is resuming. The cycle is restarting. The Drukhari rises. The Drukhari prepares. The Drukhari goes to the Cabal's staging area, where the next raid's preparation is underway. The planning, the briefing, the equipment check that the raid's execution requires. The Drukhari will participate in the raid. The Drukhari will emerge from the webway gate onto a world whose population does not know the Drukhari exist. The Drukhari will take captives. The Drukhari will return to Commorragh with the captives whose suffering will feed the Drukhari's soul. The cycle will repeat. Tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. For 10,000 years the cycle has repeated. For 10,000 years the Drukhari have fed on the suffering of others to prevent the suffering of themselves. For 10,000 years the Dark City has stood in the webway's dimensional space, sustained by the agony the raids produce, and the cruelty the culture maintains, and the hunger that drives everything the Drukhari do. The hunger never stops. The feeding never ends. The cruelty never ceases. Commorragh endures, the stolen suns burn, the arenas fill, the gates open, the raiders emerge, the captives scream, the Drukhari survive. The survival is monstrous, the monstrousness is the survival. The two are the same. The Dark City stands in the space between dimensions, lit by stolen suns, fed by stolen lives, sustained by stolen screams. 10,000 years of the cruelest survival the galaxy has produced, and the hunger that started it, the god that hunts them, the curse that drives them, the drain that depletes them, has not diminished, not by a fraction, not in 10,000 years. The hunger is eternal. The feeding must be eternal to match it. The Drukhari are eternal because they refuse to be anything else. The Dark City endures. The screaming continues.